What is up YouTube? I'm Royal, I'm rank 1 Wildrift, and in this video I'm going to be explaining every single items. This is going to be one of the most important videos I ever make, and it's going to give you a lot of knowledge. Even if you're an expert, I'm sure you're going to find, even if you're like a challenger player, you're still going to get a lot of value from this video, so I do recommend watching it no matter what your skill level is. But I'm going to be explaining every single item, when you should be building it, what it's good at, some hidden tips you might not know about it, and so on. Obviously items do change depending on patches, so some new items might get introduced if you're watching this video later on, or some items have been nerfed or buffed. Obviously my goal is to make this video as timeless as possible, but there's not much I can do about patch notes. I will also be rating the items on how good or bad they are for this current patch. Obviously this might not apply a year from now, but patch changes with items are usually quite slow. Items don't often get nerfed or buffed as often as champions. So now let's get straight into it. We're gonna go from physical to magic to defense to support to boots and then also enchantments. This is gonna be a pretty long video, however, it's packed with knowledge, so I do recommend watching the whole thing. Let's start off with Nashor's Tooth, and I'm gonna talk about Nashor's Tooth from the physical end, and then I'll also talk about it when we get to Nashor's Tooth on the magical end as well. So this is just for physical damage champions. So Nashor's Tooth gives 45% attack speed, 20 ability haste, and 30 AD. And its passive gives you bonus magic damage on each auto attack on hit. On hit means every time you auto attack, a lot of items are on hit items, like Blade of the Ruin King, like Wit's Ends. So if you ever hear me say on hit during this video, that's what I'm referring to. Every auto attack will do bonus damage. In this case, it will do 15 plus 25% bonus AD and 25% bonus magic damage. So when do you want to build this on AD champion? This item only ever gets built on AD champions when you have a huge amount of AD and you don't want crit. So it's a pretty rare item to see on AD champions. I have seen some builds in the past with Ezreal, for example, because Ezreal really benefits from the attack speed and the ability haste, while also his first ability procs the damage. And since Ezreal doesn't build crit, Nashor's Tooth is often a great option, because he gets a lot of AD from items like Mana Immune, which is the highest AD damage in the game. He gets quite a bit of AD from Trinity Force, and he also often builds both AP and AD, right? Very often Ezreal players will also build a Riftmaker later on, so you benefit from the AD AP that Riftmaker gives you. That will also apply on Nashor's Tooth because it's 25 bonus AD and 25% bonus AP. So it's a very, very, very niche situational item. Another champion you might see this build on is Kai'Sa, because again, she also often gets magic damage items like the Riftmaker. You could also potentially see this on like a Varus build. However, it's definitely a very niche item that you're not going to be building most of the time. But these are the applications that this item would be good on, right? If you have both AD and AP, then it can be very good. So AD champions that build both AD and AP. Also champions that mostly want to go on hit and get a huge amount of AD to really take advantage of that 25% bonus AD. But for most marksmen and most AD champions, right? Because most bruisers want items that give you health, like Sunder Sky, Black Cleaver, right? So we're mostly focused on full damage range champions, but those champions usually want to build crit. So Nashor's Tooth just doesn't really cut it. Moving on to Guardian Angel. Guardian Angel is an extremely niche item. It's pretty much only good for its passive. The stats that it gives are terrible. So it gives 40 AD and 40 armor. BF Sword gives 40 AD, right? Chain Vest gives 40 armor. So just the components of Guardian Angel that cost 1,500 and 900 gold. So for 2,400 gold, you can get the 40 armor and 40 magic resist. You're paying an extra 1,000 gold for the passive. And of course, Guardian Angel has the most broken passive in the game out of any item. It revives you after you die after 4 seconds, restoring 50% of your base health and your maximum mana. A few things to keep in mind. It restores base health. So champions that get a huge amount of HP like Sion, bonus HP, are not really gonna benefit from the 50% base health, because every champion has a similar base health, which is around 1,700 to 2,100. So obviously squishier champions benefit more from Guardian Angel. especially because Squisher champions are easier to kill as well. So Guardian Angel is really like a late game item. This is an item that you want to be your last item or second to last, and most of the time you want to build it on either a squishy champion or an engaged squishy champion. The problem with Guardian Angel is that very often if it procs and if you've died like as an ADC, within the next 4 seconds the fight will be over anyway, and even if you spawn there isn't really gonna be much that you can do, unless obviously your team is really far ahead, and I'll talk about that in a second because that's an important aspect of Guardian Angel as well. But you mostly want to build this on champions that will die, right? So you can get use of that passive. So champions like Vi and Wukong in the late game who build bruiser risk, right? They're not full tanks. However, they are engaged primary champions. Those champions really benefit from Guardian Angel because once you die with the Guardian Angel, obviously you spawn back up and you can do more things after your initial engage. So Guardian Angel is an extremely good item when you're ahead, right? If you're already ahead, if you're 5,000 gold ahead, the enemy team needs to desperately look for a pick on you, right? So if you're playing ADC and you're really far ahead, and the enemy team does manage to kill you, that's a huge win for them. They actually have a chance to win the team fight. But if you have Guardian Angel, it's very easy for your team to continue fighting since you're so far ahead and give you time to resurrect and continue the fight. So it's a great item when you're ahead. Now let's move on to Bloodthirster. So Bloodthirster is just the premier ADC item in general because of its passive. You gain 11 to 25 attack damage and 10% attack speed when your health is above 50%. Most of the time as an ADC your health is above 50%, right? Especially with lifesteal, you have the range advantage. Most of the time you're above 50%, and if you're below, you're probably running away or trying to heal, right? So Bloodthirster has the potential to give you in the late game 75 AD, which is an insane amount, right? But even in the early game, having 61 AD from an item right away is super useful. And pair that up with a lifesteal, which is core for any ADC, Bloodthirster, even after its nerfs that it's received, is just the premier damage item. If you just want max damage early on, Bloodthirster is your go-to item. Moving on to Blade of the Ruined King. And this is kind of similar to Bloodthirster because they're both physical vamp items. Blade of the Ruined King is different because Blade of the Ruined King is an on-hit item. It's an on-hit item, right? It grants you 6% on-hit enemy's current health damage, but if you're melee, it's 9%. And let's talk about what current health is, right? Current health means the health that they have currently, obviously. So let's say that champion has 3000 HP. You're gonna be constantly dealing on that 3000 HP. Your auto attack is gonna do, if you're ranged, 6%, if you're melee, 9% of that. So let's say that you're melee, right, and they have 3300 health. That's 300 extra damage that just Blade of the Ruined King will be doing with its passive. That's insane. But let's say that you've started the fight, you've DPS'd the enemy, and now they have 400 health, right? 9% of 400 is only gonna be doing like what, 34 damage around there? So it's not gonna be doing a lot on those situations. So the higher HP and the more HP that the enemies have, that's when Blade of the Ruined King will come in clutch. So it's a great item at the start of the fight, but it's also a great item to punish HP stackers, champions that have huge amounts of HP. Additionally, you have the Drain passive, which makes it a great kiting item or chasing item. So when you hit a champion with 3 attacks or abilities, you do a bit of damage, but more importantly, you steal 25% of their movement speed for 2 seconds. That increases your movement speed by 25%, and it decreases their movement speed by 25%. So this is just a massive advantage when chasing someone or when you're trying to kite out someone. So you would build this in situations where you want to kite. Obviously, because you only do 6% as a range and 9% as a melee, this is of course a way better range or melee item, excuse me. So champions like Jax can use this item. Champions like Yone, right, that benefit from that 25% movement speed as well. And it procs on his first ability, right? Yone is a great champion with Blade of the Ruined King. So those champions that want to chase you down and also beat up tanks pretty easily. Tryndamere has also historically been a decent user of Blade of the Ruined King. Master Yi, who loves the movement speed increase and the movement speed decrease for the enemy, so he can chase you down and no attack you. Of course, Master Yi's passive also procs Blade of the Ruined King because it procs on hit effects. those types of champions really benefit from Blade of the Ruined King. I would recommend usually not getting on ADC. Obviously it depends on the meta, the ADC that it's on. Like obviously on Twitch maybe you can get it situationally. I've seen it be okay on Vayne, but obviously Vayne is more of like a solo lane type of ADC. I've seen it be okay on Kalista, but for the most part you don't want to be building this on ADCs unless you really need it to punish some of these higher HP targets, and also if you need the extra kiting power. Obviously it's going to be really good against champions like Darius, Garen, that you want to kite out. Let's move on to Runaan's Hurricane. So Runaan's Hurricane gives terrible stats, right? You spend 3,000 gold for 35 attack speed and 20 AD. These are some terrible stats, right? Blade of the Ruined King also has pretty terrible stats, right? 25 AD for 35% attack speed, but you also get the lifesteal at least. And it does have two different passives that are really powerful. But Runaan's has terrible stats on its own. However, its passive makes up for it. You get 2 additional auto attacks that have slightly higher range than your champion, and you also deal 15 bonus physical damage on hit. So all your attacks are going to do 15 extra damage, and you also have 2 little bolts that shoot out, and those bolts apply on hit effects. That's what's really crucial about this. So let's say you have Blade of the Ruined King, let's say you have Wit's Ends, right? Your Runaan's Hurricane is gonna apply those on-hit effects on the enemy. This item is extremely good with lethal tempo, which slightly increases your range, because Runaan's Hurricane again has slightly more range than your auto attacks. So high range champions benefit from Runaan's Hurricane a lot. The biggest user of Runaan's Hurricane is obviously Jinx. Jinx and her rockets, right, work and synergize well with Runaan's Hurricane because the on-hit effect of the rockets, like the AoE damage, gets applied on Runaan's Hurricane, so you just do insane AoE damage, right? Also, those strikes can critically strike, which is why you're comfortable building it on crit champions. Another beneficiary of this item is Caitlyn. Her headshot passive works really well with Runaan's Hurricane, right? So you want to be building it on champions that just benefit a lot from those on-hit effects, while also want to build a lot of damage. Twitch is another one, right? His passive procs Runaan's Hurricane, or it gets applied by Runaan's Hurricane. So those ranged champions, obviously you cannot build Runaan's Hurricane on melees, but those ranged champions do benefit a lot. The ones that do have on-hit effects either on their kit, or you want to be building on-hit on them. What I would like to mention about Runaan's is that it's particularly good against many melee champions. So if the enemies have 3 or 4 melee champions, Runaan's Hurricane benefits a lot from that. Because one of the issues with Runaan's Hurricane, right? Imagine that you're fighting enemies, right? Let's say that one enemy is all the way here on Terminus, and the other enemy is here in Immortal Shield Bow. And you're all the way on a Magnetic Blaster. And you're attacking the enemy on the Shield Bow, right? But since this guy is so far away, he's ranged, you're not going to be getting the Runaan's damage on them, right? But if the enemies have 3 melees, right? Wit's Ends, Immortal Shield Bow, and Black Lever, and you're the Magnetic Blaster, you're hitting all 3 of them with Runaan's. So you should get Runaan's when you can actually apply its passive and have it be useful. If the champions are too ranged, right, you're not going to be getting many auto attacks off on them anyway. So it works even better against melee champions. Now let's talk about Youmuu's Ghostblade. So Youmuu's is an interesting item because it's turbo OP. Its passive gives you 40 movement speed and allows you to quickly move around the map, and when you start the combat you gain 25% attack speed. You obviously get 15 armor penetration, 55 AD, which is quite a lot, and 15 ability haste. This is the premier assassin item, which allows you to easily move around the map. Youmuu's Ghostblade is usually built as a first item because it gives you a lot of tempo, right? You're able to move across the map super quickly, clearing your camps, ganking. So of course it's always built on roamers or junglers. So champions like Zed, Kha'Zix, Talon obviously is a big one, benefit a lot from Youmuu's Ghostblade as a first item because of that movement speed, but also because it gives the perfect stats that they're looking for, right? Armor penetration, attack damage, ability haste. Some notable champions that are not junglers or mid laners Spike, for example, Pike loves Yomu, so he can roam around, grab champions with his hooks, and of course he benefits from all the stats. So Yomu is actually a very, very, very strong item, mostly because of its insanely good passive, especially in the early game. It just allows you to be everywhere. Like Kane with Yomu's just running through walls, right? 40 flat movement speed is so broken. In general, flat movement speed is an exceptionally good stat because it benefits from all the speed ups. Let's say that you have 300 movement speed, right? And you gain plus 15% movement speed from an item or a shield or a speed up that your team gives you, right? That 15% works on the 300. But if you have 340, because you have 40 extra movement speed from Yomu's, that 15% gets applied on all 340 movement speed. So flat movement speed, which you pretty much only get from boots, right? Boots give flat movement speed, flat 45, and the basic ones give flat 25. You can get it from a couple items like Yomu's, and another one, common other example is Deadman's Plate, which gives another 40 movement speed, similar to Yomu's. So it's a really rare stat to get, and it goes a long way, especially on a damage item like Yomu's. And now we have Duskblade of Drakthar, which is Yomu's shittier younger brother, right? Duskblade gives a little more armor pen than Yomu's, so it gives a little more damage, but you lose the ability haste. And Night Stalker, its passive just gives some flat damage and a slow. So the first attack against enemy champion deals 60 to 160 bonus physical damage. And when it says first attack, it's only referring to auto attacks. So if you have a champion that doesn't often auto attack, especially later in the game like Zed actually doesn't take a great advantage of Duskblade. But the slow can always be useful for assassinations, right? Because that allows you to do your full combo once they're slowed. But the damage is just not very high, 60 to 160, it falls off really hard in the late game. So Duskblade is an item that you really want to build second if you're going to build it on an assassin. But most of the time there's better options. But if you're just looking for the max damage option, then Duskblade is your go-to. Also, something I haven't really mentioned a lot so far into this video is the build paths. Build paths do play a role in Wild Rift. For example, the build path of Runans is actually pretty bad. Like this Nasher Stalin, it gives 20 AD for 800 gold. It just kind of feels bad to build and locks you immediately into going Runans. Like a lot of items have not great build paths, right? Duskblade and Yomu just build out of longswords, so the build path is pretty standard. But a lot of items just generally don't have great build paths, and obviously if they're super expensive too, you want to have a good build path. Like Guardian Angel feels so bad if you're able to get the components, but not the extra 1000 gold for the passive. It's not super important, it's more of an advanced level topic, talking about the build path of items, but it's important to start thinking about that too, right? Moving on to Sterak's Cage. So Sterak's Cage is an incredibly powerful but also niche item. So it gives 400 HP, but it also gives 50% base attack damage as bonus damage. So every champion has, a different base attack damage. Some champions, usually bruisers, have really high base attack damage, and some other champions, usually like mages or some ADCs, have really low base attack damage. So the higher your base attack damage is, the better this item is on you. That's why you often see it on bruisers. However, there's some ADCs that have exceptionally high base attack damages, like Tristana, like Ezreal. There's a few more. Corki has a pretty... Actually, I think Corki's got buffed, but it's still not that high. Anyway, the higher your attack, your base attack damage, and that goes champion by champion, the better Sterak's Cage will be on you. Because half your base damage gets converted into bonus attack damage. There's some champions that super late into the game have like 130 to 140 even base attack damage. So you can get 60, 65 or even 70 bonus AD from Sterak's. And obviously base attack damage scales by level too. So you have your base attack damage at level 1, but it gets increased later on. So Sterak's is better into the later game. But obviously that's not 90% of the reason you can buy Sterak's is because of its passive, right? Which scales with bonus HP. So you want to build Sterak's if you have high base damage, like most bruisers do, and if you have high health, bonus health, right? Because it's not based on It's not based on base health, it's based on bonus health. So champions that stack health. So Sterak's synergizes very well with other HP stacking items, like Black Cleaver that gives 400, like Sunderer Sky that gives 300, like Titanic Hydra 450, even the more defensive items like the Heartsteel, right? So you want to build Sterak's when you have a lot of HP to really take advantage of that shield. It also gives you 30% tenacity, which is again great for bruisers that are in the front line and are constantly getting crowd controlled. So most of the time you're going to be building this item against on bruisers in the late game. Champions like Garen benefit a lot from this, champions like Darius, Riven, right? So it's a really good item for those champions. Also, I just kind of realized I haven't really been rating the items, saying if they're good or bad. If an item is exceptionally good or exceptionally bad, I'm definitely going to point it out. The only times that we've seen like exceptionally bad items has been Nashor's Tooth for AD champions, but it can be situationally good. And Duskblade is just a little underwhelming, it's just a full damage item, right? Speaking of full damage items, moving on to Infinity Edge. So Infinity Edge is just the max crit damage item. It gives you 60 AD, which is a lot, and also just increases your critical strikes to deal 205 damage instead of 175, which is the normal crit rate damage. So there's two situations that you want to build Infinity Edge, right? Let's assume that you want to build max damage, right? These are the two max damage items on ADC. Moral Reminder and Infinity Edge. These are the crit damage, max damage items. Moral Reminder, while it only gives 30 AD, which is half of Infinity Edge, gives 33% armor penetration. So if an enemy has 200 armor, you're going to be able to decrease 66 of that, which is insane, right? 66 armor is just gone. So Moral Reminder is your best option in terms of damage when the enemies have a lot of armor. If the enemies don't have a lot of armor, Infinity Edge is your best bet in terms of damage. And of course this applies on champions that build crit. I don't want to see you building Infinity Edge on Zed, for example, right? Infinity Edge is a great item on those ADC champions that build crit if you're looking for max damage. And of course, Moral Reminder, it would be the second choice if the enemies have a lot of armor. So a lot of builds nowadays for ADCs, like max damage builds, would be Bloodthirster, and then often you'd see like an attack speed item all of the time, like Magnetic Blaster. Some ADCs go no attack speed item and they're gonna avoid Quick Blades if they have attack speed in their kit anyway, right? And then third item, you would see Moral Reminder if the enemies are tanky, or Infinity Edge if they're not tanky, and then Moral Reminder. So speaking of Moral Reminder, this is an item that you're pretty much always going to be building on ADCs as a third or fourth item, sometimes as a second item, but rarely. A lot of the times what ADCs do is they build the Executioner's Calling for the anti-heal, and then they finish their Moral Reminder when the enemies get more tanky, right? And that's kind of what I recommend doing for the most part, right? It's an insanely powerful item against tanks and against healing champions. Some ADCs will go Shrilda's Grudge, like Ezreal. That's the main one I've seen it on. AD Varus, maybe, like Lethality Varus, right? But for the most part, this item gives you the critical rate and the armor penetration, so it's usually a better deal for ADCs. Moving on to Metamune. So most AD champions don't really have mana issues. The only two champions that are AD that you would really build Metamune on are Corki and Ezreal. But you don't just build it for the mana, you build it for the stats and the passive of Muramana. So once you get your mana crystal, Sapphire Crystal, you can start stacking the tier, which is this. And obviously they stack faster the more upgraded it is, right? Sapphire Crystal gives you 5 mana every time. The tier gives you 7 mana every time and gives you the refund as well and gives better stats. And then the Metamune gives 10 every time and you cap at 700. Obviously when you use abilities, but also Metamune is on all attacks as well. So once you get Metamune, you stack it really quickly. It gives 25 base AD, 300 mana and 20 ability haste. But when you fully stack it, you get 1000 mana, right? And when it's just a mana immune, you get 1.5% of your mana as AD, as bonus AD. So if you have 300 mana, right, 1.5% of 300, you get that as bonus AD. But when you get Mura mana, right, 1,000 mana, right, times 2% now, 0.02, and that's 20 AD, right, on top of the 25 AD. So Mura mana overall will give you 45 AD when you have it all stacked up, but you have to take into account your base mana as well. A lot of champions have 1,500 to 2,000, or they have an extra, an extra 1,000 mana by the end of the game. Obviously, if you build more mana items, you'll have more, but just your base mana is an extra 1,000 mana. So take 20 AD from the 1,000 mana gives you, take 20 AD from your base mana and the base damage of Mura mana, and you can get 65 plus AD from this item. So it gives a huge amount of AD for a fraction of the cost of every other item, right? Infinity Edge, which gives 60, costs 3,400. Mana Immune costs 2,700. Obviously, the downside of this is that it takes a long time for it to stack up. But other than the huge stats it gives an incredibly, strong passive. When dealing ability damage to enemy champions, you drain 4% of your current mana, and you deal physical damage equal to the amount consumed plus 6% bonus AD. So, this is an incredibly powerful effect on champions that spellcast. So, Corki is the best example of this, right? Corki uses so many spells to do damage, and of course, all of them get increased by Mana Immune and they do more damage, right? It's actually an absurd amount of damage. So Mura mana and Mana Immune is an item that you build on spellcaster AD champions, right? Champions that mostly focus on their spells. So Ezreal, Corki can be done on Varus, however it's not optimal. A better option would be Essence Reaver, and we'll talk about that when we get there. But pretty much just spellcaster AD champions. Sometimes you can see it on champions like Jace, right? More rarely. Most bruisers want to have a stronger early game, right? They don't want to be seeing their scaling, so they avoid Mana Immune, even if in theory it would be good on them. Those are mostly the champions you see it on. Another champion, I guess, is Kaisa. This is a bit of a spellcaster, so he benefits a bit from Mana Immune. The problem in Wild Rift and mana items in general is that most champions don't really care about mana. It's an absolute resource. You just have so much base mana. There's so many other ways of getting mana that like tier and Mana Immune is usually not great, kind of stalls your early game. But on those champions, on those particular champions, it's extremely strong. Moving on to Trinity Force, and this is the most complete item in the game, right? 250 max health, 30 attack damage, 30 attack speed, 25 ability haste, 5% movement speed. The stats that this item gives you for 3,333 gold are actually insane. It's a lot of stats. It's very valuable as an item, right? Another way of looking at items is their gold efficiency. I haven't mentioned that yet, but gold efficiency matters, right? An item like Rune's Hurricane, I said, gives you no stats for 3,000 gold, right? You get 35 attack speed and 20 AD for 3,000 gold. You're spending a lot of gold for not a lot of stats. It's the passive you get it for. Guardian Angel, same thing. You get 2,400 gold worth of stats, which you can buy as the components, but this costs 3,400, so you're really buying it for the passive. Trinity Force, however, for 3,333 has a lot of really good stats, right? It has 30 AD and 30 attack speed, which is like similar to Blade of the Ruined King, which has 25 AD and 35 attack speed. So just the AD and the attack speed that you get from Trinity Force is more valuable than a whole Blade of the Ruined King. But on top of that, you also have the ability haste, you also have the movement speed, you also have the HP. So Trinity Force is a very, very complete item with a decent passive as well, right? It gives you a lot of movement speed. So it has two passives. The first one does damage, so it does 200% base AD, and we talked about base AD before with Sterix Cage, but the more base AD you have, the more Trinity Force is going to deal. So champions with high base AD are going to benefit a lot more from Trinity Force, and that's why you often see it on bruisers, even though it can be built on a lot of ADCs as well, especially those that have higher base AD, and also benefit from all of these stats. Usually spellcasters, right? Ezreal benefits a huge amount from Trinity Force because his first ability actually procs the Trinity Force. So Trinity Force is a great item on champions that can easily proc it with like an empowered attack, like Ezreal Q, Jack's second ability, right? As long as you can easily proc the Spellblade effect, Trinity Force can be a great item, especially if you benefit from all of these stats. Additionally, it has the movement speed passive, which is great for kiting for a lot of champions like Ezreal, like Corki, but also it's great for chasing for champions like Darius sometimes, Riven sometimes, like in the jungle. I've seen this item very commonly built on a Mbessa, for example. So bruisers that really benefit from the movement speed passive and have an easy time proccing Spellblade, and of course make use of all of these stats, right? Because you don't want to be wasting stats. And Trinity Force obviously has like 5 different ones. A great item overall. Moving on to Mauve Malmortius, and I think this is a pretty underrated item, but I'm seeing it build more and more, and I like seeing that. So Mauve Malmortius gives 55 AD, 45% magic resist, which is quite a bit, and 10 ability haste. So the problem with Mauve Malmortius is that it doesn't really give HP. And a lot of these tank items, right, that give magic resist or armor benefit a lot from HP because it makes the armor and magic resist more effective. If you have 1000 HP and 40 and 50 magic resist, let's say, the 50 magic resist gets applied on that 1000 HP, right? If you have 5000 HP, you're making better use of that 50 magic resist because it gets applied on all 5000 HP. So items that give resistances without HP usually suffer if you're not getting any HP. That's why Mauve Malmortius is a great item, mostly on bruisers. But what's really interesting about Mauve Malmortius, the passive is 20% of the damage that your attacks deal, or 15% of the physical damage that your abilities deal is converted into magic shield. So it's really important that you deal physical damage to make use of Mauve Malmortius. Let's take a champion like Corki, for example. Corki does mostly magic damage, right? So he's not going to fully benefit from Mauve Malmortius. Or another example, again, Ezreal. I've been mentioning those champs a lot because of how their kit works. It allows to make these analogies. Ezreal, for example, doesn't really benefit of Mauve Malmortius because 15% of the physical damage that your ability deals is converted into magic shield. Ezreal mostly deals magic damage with his abilities, even though his first ability and his attacks do physical damage. Another example is Kai'Sa, right? Those champions that deal magic damage with their abilities don't get full use of Mauve Malmortius. However, obviously bruisers that do physical damage make great use of Mauve Malmortius. Most other ADCs make great use of Mauve Malmortius, that their attacks are physical damage based and their abilities are physical damage based, right? And it's a great option against magic damage dealers. The flat shield makes it very lucrative for champions that don't have a huge amount of HP either, right? Because if you're like a Scion with 10,000 HP, you don't really care about a 400 magic damage shield, right? But if you're an ADC, then any shield counts. So Mauve Malmortius is this weird item that's good on both bruisers and ADCs, but bruisers benefit the most because they have a bit of HP, not so much where the shield won't matter, but enough for the magic resist to really matter and come into effect. Overall, it's a great item on ADCs and bruisers if you're looking for a defensive magic resist option, right? Let's move on to Magnetic Blaster. So Magnetic Blaster, again, terrible stats as you can see. 25 crit rate, 35% attack speed. It's probably the worst stats of any item we've seen so far. 5% movement speed, but he has one of the most powerful passives in the game. One of your attacks will have increased range by 125 and 54 melee attacks, but you're pretty much only getting this item on ranged champions. And it will have the old static shift passive where it's going to bounce up to 5 enemies, do 50 to 120 bonus magic damage, which can critically strike, obviously works really good with crit. So this item gives terrible stats, but the range increase is extremely beneficial in a lot of ADCs. Champions like Caitlyn make great use of it since she already has high range. Like her first auto attack, she's going to auto attack you from 20 miles away, and there's nothing you can do. You can't fight her back. She just pokes you without auto attack, right? So Magnetic Blaster is great on ADCs that want a little more range. It works specifically so good on Caitlyn because of her headshot passive as well. She can stack up her headshot, go and just auto attack you from 3,000 miles away and just chunk you for like 30% of your HP. It also synergizes extremely well with the item Storm Rager, which on your first auto attack, you slow a target by 50% and you gain 45 movement speed for 0.75 seconds. So it's pretty much like a slow on your first auto attack, right? If you're able to get the auto attack from a super long range, then Magnetic Blaster makes Storm Rager an even better item. It's a very common combo that you're seeing nowadays, mostly on like more utility focused champions like Jhin, but also Caitlyn, right? You kind of play Caitlyn in this utility sense where you slow champions for your team to catch them. You rush the Storm Rager, which gives you just way better stats, right? Lets you get through the game a lot easier in the early game. But then you go Magnetic Blaster and you just have this huge slow from very far away. Jhin in particular absolutely loves this combo because it synergizes so well with his second ability, right? You go Magnetic, you do Storm Rager into Magnetic Blaster, you auto attack someone from 3,000 miles away, and then you use your second ability to root them, and then your team can follow up. That's like a little mini pick and gauge, right? Another champion that Magnetic Blaster is surprisingly good on is Twisted Fate because of his stun card, right? Being able to increase the range of that stun is crucial. So despite him being an AP champion, a lot of Twisted Fate players will go Magnetic Blaster just for that additional range. That's how powerful that passive is. However, the stats it gives are really, really bad. So if your goal is to go max damage, right, there's better attack speed items out there. Like the Phantom Dancer, which is not often built, and I will talk a lot about Phantom Dancer after. But a lot of champions also have attack speed on their kits will go Navori Quick Blades, like most ADCs do. Most ADCs that are not caster based, right? The caster based ones will go Trinity Force, which of course will give you attack speed and so on. Moving on to Death's Dance, and that's a very similar item to Mauve Malmortius in the sense that it gives you armor and attack damage and ability haste, right? Similar stats of Mauve Malmortius. However, it has 20 less AD than Mauve Malmortius and even gives less magic resist. But it makes up with its incredible passive, right? So I would recommend not building this on a ranged champion pretty much ever, because the damage reduction is only 12% when you're playing ranged, but when you're playing melee, it's 32%. So when you take physical damage, 32% of that physical damage you took, let's say you take 100 damage, 32 of that is going to be dealt to you over 3 seconds as true damage. So you're still taking the damage, right? But you take it more slowly. So champions that heal a lot or champions that have shields that they proc, this item is extremely good on them because you don't get bursted as fast. You have more time to react, get those heals, get those shields, right? And if you take down a champion, first of all, it removes that 32% true damage that you're gonna take and heals you by 10% over 2 seconds. So a lot of bruisers love this item. The best champion to utilize this item is probably Darius, right? Because you can get bursted as fast, you can get your passive stacks easier, and once you kill someone with your ulti after you've gotten your passive stacks, you don't end up taking that damage that you should have taken, and you restore more health. So you can keep dunking on people, right? So that's a perfect example of where Death's Dance is useful. But it's also great on a lot of other bruisers, like the Riven, which again, similar concept, you don't get bursted, you kill someone, you get back your HP. So it's mostly used on bruisers. However, the stats it gives are kind of underwhelming. And obviously, it's not as good on ranged champions. 12% is just really not a lot. So this is an item that mostly benefits bruisers, especially vampiric bruisers like Aatrox, for example, right? If Aatrox is taking a lot of damage, he can heal that back up with his own abilities, so he's less affected. If you don't burst him down, he will heal back to full with his abilities, and obviously he can tank the 32% after that, right? So vampiric bruisers also benefit a lot from Death's Dance. It's pretty much an anti-burst item. Champions that don't want to get bursted. That's why in Darius you build Death's Dance, you build Sterak's, your goal is to not get bursted so you can get your stacks out. Moving on to Phantom Dancer, and this is a pretty underrated item. It was very overtuned a while ago and it got nerfed. However, I still think it's quite decent. The movement speed you get is insane. It's just a matter of knowing how to use that movement speed. So the stats it gives are actually pretty good. 25 AD, 25 crit, and 30% attack speed, and a base 5% movement speed. But every time you auto attack, you gain an extra 7% movement speed, which is obviously quite a lot, overall giving you 12% movement speed when you're auto attacking. But what it also does is it gives you 25% additional attack speed after auto attacking for 4 times. So kind of similar to Lethal Tempo, obviously nowhere near as much attack speed. But overall, when you have this all stacked up and you're auto attacking, this item gives you 25 AD, 55 attack speed, 25 crit rate, and of course 12% movement speed. So stats wise, this item is insane. However, you don't often see it built. And the reason for that is because movement speed is just not as valuable as damage or utility when it comes to ADCs. So when you're playing a champion like Caitlyn, you often care more about Stormrazor Magnetic, or you just want to go full damage with Bloodthirster Moral Reminder. Phantom Dancer just doesn't really do that for you. And the extra movement speed, while it is nice, especially for kiting out champions, it just makes it very situational. The champions that do benefit from Phantom Dancer the most is probably Jinx, because she really loves the attack speed. She benefits from all the stats and benefits from the movement speed a lot. Right, she wants her movement speed to kite out champions since she doesn't have a lot of self-peel. I've seen this item be decent on Zarya, who also benefits a lot from the movement speed. But overall, this item, I personally think it's quite underrated. I don't see as much as I think I should, but it's not a great item and it is very situational. Moving on to Wit's End. I think Wit's End is a terrible item. I'm just going to get out of the way. It gives 45% attack speed and 45% magic resist. And your auto attacks deal on hit 15 to 65 damage, to 65 bonus magic damage. And while you're below 50% health, you heal for the damage that deals. Melees get 100% and range get 33%. So particularly on ranged champions, I actually think this item is really bad. The damage it gives is extremely low, and I would honestly stay away from it. Most champions, obviously if it gets buffed in the future, ignore this advice. This is mostly for its current state, right? A lot of champions fall into this trick of thinking, oh, it's gonna make me tanky because it gives 45 magic resist, right? But so does Maw of Malmortius, and it's a way better passive that you get the shield, right? And it gives you 55 AD, which is a lot more valuable than 45% attack speed. The issue with ranged champions as well is that they don't really make good use of the healing passive, especially when you're low HP as an ADC. You're not even auto-attacking that much, and even if you are, you're getting like what? Even when it's fully late game, you're getting back 20 HP. Like that's not that useful. 25 HP, that's not that useful. You're gonna be getting way more from items like Bloodthirster or Blade of the Ruined King at that point. Some melee champions do make good use of it. Obviously, tank Yasuo is a prime example, and I think that's the only champion that you can really build it on. But even then, I prefer going for Blade of the Ruined King. So overall, Witch Ends I think is a very overrated item. I think it's quite weak, and I think Maw of Malmortius is a better option in 90% of cases. However, that might change. When is it good? It's good when you're playing a champion that benefits a lot from on hit and you want magic resist, right? So champions like Irelia, champions like Yasuo, possibly Yone, even though crit is obviously way better on him, can benefit from this against champions that do magic damage, have a better 1v1 against them because you're itemizing magic resist against those magic damage dealing champions. However, overall, again, don't highly recommend it. Moving on to Essence Reaver. Essence Reaver is an incredibly strong item on certain champions. So champions like Varus. That's about the list. It's a Varus, it can be played on Ezreal, but it's not great. He prefers Metamune, same thing with Corki. However, it's meant to be a spell casting AD item. The way that it works is the more crit you get, the more percentage your attacks, the more crit you get, the more percent your first ability will be enhanced by. Up to 30% based on crit. So just by getting Essence Reaver, you're getting 25% of that 100%, right? It pretty much gives you enhance damage on your abilities. So Varus benefits from this with his ultimate and his first ability, and obviously his third ability as well. But because he does so much burst, right? His ulti does insane damage, his first ability does insane damage. He has so much burst, like increasing an ability that does like 500 damage by even 10% is an extra 50 damage, right? On champions that don't do a lot of damage with abilities, obviously this is useless. So it's a very, very niche item that's pretty much only really good on Varus right now. Obviously you can build it on other champions, but it's not super good. And attacks restore 3% missing mana, so Varus that does kind of have mana issues, that helps a lot, but most ADCs and crit champions don't really have mana issues, other than Corki and Ezreal, who again prefer mana immune. But that's the main issue with Essence Reaver. It competes with mana immune, and there's only a few champions that want to build either one of them. So it's pretty much only good on Varus right now. Obviously, if it gets buffed in the future or slightly changed, it could be good on different champions, but its main issue is, again, competes with mana immune. Mana immune is better on most champions. Still, great option for Varus, I guess, who's a really, really OP champion. Moving on to Cyrilda's Grudge. This is the other Armor Pen AD item. You have Mortal Reminder and you have Cyrilda's Grudge, right? That give % armor penetration, so it's the choice against tank champions or champions with a lot of armor. The main difference between Mortal Reminder is that it gets 10 more AD, but you don't get the crit, and you get 15 ability haste instead of the crit. And the passive, instead of getting anti-heal, is a slow. So you build this item when you really don't care about anti-heal or crit. So let's say you're playing Zed, for example, right? Zed's third ability already slows with his shadows, so it's not perfect on him. However, it's decent if you don't care about anti-heal. This gives you better stats, right? You get the ability haste that you really want and you get more AD. So if you don't care about anti-heal and you still need an item to kill tanks, you go with Cyrilda's Grudge. The slow is not super useful because it's only 1 second. However, it can be useful on champions like Ezreal, for example. If that spam your first ability and you can keep slowing them over and over again, makes it easier to hit the rest of your abilities. It's really good on Talon. You can use your second ability to slow. Your ulti obviously is going to slow too. And that's kind of when you build Cyrilda's Grudge as compared to Mortal Reminder. Mortal Reminder is usually the better choice because of the anti-heal, and just Wildrift has a lot of healing in the game. But if you really don't need the anti-heal, Cyrilda's Grudge is your other option, right? Moving on to Solari Charge Blade, and Solari Charge Blade is an extremely interesting item. Every time you use an ability, you get a charge, and your next auto attack will get rid of that charge. It's up to 3 charges and deal bonus damage on hit, and of course this can critically strike. The stats you get are actually pretty interesting. You get a lot of attack speed, crit rate, and ability haste. The issue with this item, in my opinion, is that it doesn't give damage, right? If it gave like if it gave in a bit more AD, like if it gave less attack speed and a bit more AD, it would be useful. But the problem is, because of its stats, it becomes very niche. Like you can't really build it on champions that you can really build it on spellcasters a lot, because spellcasters don't really care about the attack speed that much. A champion like Corki doesn't really care about the attack speed that much, right? You want to spam his spells, and that's what this item is made for. So the only champion that really benefits from this item is Lucian. Mostly because he can proc it twice with his passive. So let's say you have it all charged up, you can dash in, and both your auto attacks from your passive are gonna proc the damage, right? And that's an insane burst, especially when paired up with Magnetic Blaster. This is a common build you see on Lucian, right? Infinity Edge, Magnetic Blaster, and Solari Charge Blade combo. The issue is that 2 of these items only give attack speed, so you get no AD. So that's the main issue with Solari Charge Blade. It's usually not an item you want to be building. If you really need an attack speed item, again, all 3 attack speed items, which are Magnetic Blaster, Solari Charge Blade, and Phantom Dancer, it's not very good right now. I would probably avoid this item unless you're playing Lucian, but even then I don't really think it's that good. Most other champions can really make advantage, take advantage of this item because of the stats that it gives, right? If it gave AD instead of attack speed, I think it could be a way better item. When you would build it is again on spellcasting champions that also auto attack, so that of course also go crit, by the way. You have to take that into account. I have seen this build on Riven sometimes, right? But again, the stats that it gives are not great. The ability haste is nice, but the attack speed is useless. The crit is, it's okay on Riven, it's not bad. But again, doesn't give you bruiser and HP stats. It's good on Lucian, like I said. In theory, it should be good on Corki, but again, he doesn't really want all this much attack speed, right? In theory, it's okay on Xayah, but again, not great because she doesn't have that many abilities with low cooldowns to keep proccing it over and over. Overall, decent item, especially since it can critically strike, so it works with Infinity Edge as well. You can really get a lot of damage, and the stats it gives, while they're not good for the item, it's a lot of stats, right? 40% attack speed and 20 ability haste with 25% crit rate is quite a lot. Moving on to Navori Quick Blades. This is a very niche item, but in the niche situations that it's good at, it's really good. So critical attacks reduce your non-ultimate cooldown abilities by 20% of the remaining cooldowns. So the champions that really abuse this item well, it's funny because this item gives AD when it feels like it should give attack speed, and this item gives attack speed when it feels like it should give AD. If you just swap like the stats around, I think both of these items will actually benefit quite a lot. That's really funny. Anyway, critical attacks reduce your non-ultimate cooldowns. So champions like Sivir, champions like Xayah, champions like Tristana that have an ability that gives them huge attack speed can use this item instead of an attack speed item, right? Because it reduces their attack speed spell. So let's say you're playing Tristana, right? You have a 9-second cooldown on your first ability, which gives you like 100% attack speed or something crazy like that. You can use Navori to use your ability, get that attack speed, auto-attack a few times, and by the time the attack speed has run out, you have it back up again because of Navori reducing the cooldown. So you want to build this on AD champions, crit AD champions that want to lower their cooldowns more than they want to do damage. Another decent choice for Navori Quick Blades is Yone. Yone with Navori Quick Blades is pretty good because his first ability gets impacted by this, so you can have it up more often. Your second ability gets impacted by this, so it gives you more damage because you use your ability so often in the fight. I've seen Lucian build this. Xayah obviously build this quite often because Xayah's a lot of her damage comes from her second and third ability and her feathers in general. So having those abilities up more often definitely gives her like more damage than an attack speed item would, right? So Navori Quick Blades pretty much, if your champion cares more about their abilities being up than just doing straight damage, great option, right? Most other ADCs want to go Bloodthirster, Infinity Edge, Mortal Reminder, even though that doesn't really give a lot of attack speed, that's like max damage, right? A lot of ADCs want to go Magnetic Blaster, Storm Razor, right? Champions you wouldn't want to get this on, obviously nothing that doesn't build crit, because the attacks have to actually crit to reduce the cooldown. Another example is Tryndamere. Tryndamere is pretty good with this item. He can keep decreasing his third ability cooldown and keep chasing you down. Champions that you wouldn't want to build this on is most other crit champions. Obviously, it's terrible on a champion like Jhin, right? Where you don't auto-attack that much because you need to keep auto-attacking to reduce your cooldowns. Terrible on Caitlyn because your abilities aren't that important, right? Terrible on Jinx. Again, your abilities not that important. You're only using them once or twice per fight. And you don't care about using them more. You're more auto-attack focused. All your damage comes from your auto-attacks, right? I've seen this on Kai'Sa, however, I don't think it's very good. Anyway, so it's a good item, just very niche. Moving on to Edge of Night. Edge of Night is a surprisingly good item, and most spell shield items are, because it allows you to pretty much completely negate a spell when you're going in, which can be huge damage, especially in the late game where every spell counts, right? It gives you good stats, 250 HP, 50 AD, and 8 armor penetration. The main issue with it is that it doesn't give ability haste. So champions that love ability haste, like Zed, Talon, like those types of assassins, Lee Sin, right? They don't get any ability haste from this item, but the HP is really nice to make you a little tankier. So a very common build on Lee Sin, for example, is rushing Youmuu's, going Trinity Force, and then going either Edge of Night or Mortal Reminder, and then getting the other one. Edge of Night just allows you to go in, do your damage, and then get out with one less spell from the enemy. So if the enemies have like a Blitzcrank or a Thresh or a Nautilus, that's something that's ready to interrupt your engage. Gragas, right? Something's gonna interrupt your engage or your fight, and you're playing an Assassin or even Bruiser champion, right? Edge of Night can really come in clutch, especially in the late game where every ability counts, so being able to completely negate one is super useful. And that's pretty much the situations that you build Edge of Night on champions that can obviously make use of the stats, and you really want to be able to block one ability. I think I pretty much always get versus Gragas when I'm playing something like a Lee Sin or a Zed. With Lee Sin, for example, you hit your first ability, you can't actually take your first ability on Gragas because she's going to body slam you and cancel you and then probably just one-shot you. But Edge of Night stops him from doing that, so it turns the matchup around. Moving on to Divine Sunder. Divine Sunder is a very interesting item as well. It's a Spellblade item similar to Trinity Force, so you cannot build both of them because they have the same passive. You can only build one of them. And instead of just flat damage based on AD, Divine Sunder does damage based on the target's maximum HP. 10% for ranged and 7% for melee and 10% for ranged. The stats it gives are actually quite good. It gives a lot of health, decent AD, and a lot of ability haste. It also heals you. So this is a great anti-tank item, especially versus HP stackers. So let's say I'm playing Jax versus Sion. This item just automatically wins me the matchup because every 1.5 second I can do 10% of his max health and heal for 60% of the target's max health. So the more HP they have, the more I heal as well. You see this very often on tank Yasuo for the exact same reason, right? Obviously on range it's really bad because the stats fall to 7% and the healing to 2.5%. But so this is mostly like a bruiser item, right? You want to get this on Jax, you want to get this on Fiora. It's pretty much a debate on those bruiser champions if they want to go Trinity Force or Divine Sunder. The champions that benefit more from the attack speed usually go Trinity Force. The more bruiser risk champions usually go Divine Sunder. And obviously depends on matchup. The tankier the enemies are, the better Divine Sunder becomes. And again, like I said, you want to build this on bruiser champions that take advantage of the stats and they want to fight tanks. They take advantage of the healing. Fiora is obviously a good champion. You can even just build this on Garen. Spellblade works with his first ability, right? Moving on, Serpent's Fang. Serpent's Fang is the same thing as Youmuu's and Duskblade. It has very similar stats, but you build this against shielding. I see a lot of people build this just because the enemies have one shield. It's not worth it. You want to be building Serpent's Fang when the enemies have quite a bit of shielding, right? Especially when the key enemies that you need to kill have shielding, right? You don't build Serpent's Fang for set. I've seen a lot of people obsess over, oh, the enemies have set, you gotta build Serpent's Fang. You really don't. Like, you don't care about set's shielding. You care about the shielding of Vayne, Kai'Sa, Rihanna. You care about the shielding of the champions that you need to one-shot, right? As an assassin. That's when Serpent's Fang becomes very good. Obviously, you don't really want to be building this on most ADCs, especially crit-based ADCs. It's more of a assassin item, spellcaster item, right? And that's where it shows up big. And obviously, the more AD you have, the better the shield reduction is. So the more AD you have, the better. Obviously, you're going to build this on assassins like Talon, like Zed, like Kha'Zix, Kayn, when the enemies have shielding on key targets that you want to kill. You don't build this versus Sion, or you don't even build this against Vi. Obviously, if they have a lot of shielding in general, right? If they have both Sion and Vi in the same team, then yes, Serpent's Fang value increases, right? But you have to compare the Serpent's Fang value versus items like Edge of Night, Duskblade, Eclipse, right? And decide if the anti-shield will be worth it or not that game. Moving on to Immortal Shieldbow. This is another crit item. It's a vampiric item, so similar to Bloodthirster and Blood of the Ruined King. It gives a bit of vamp. It only gives 5%, which is actually more now since these two items got nerfed from 12 to 10. 5% actually seems like a decent amount. And it gives you a huge shield, especially in the early game, right? It used to be based on crit, but now they've changed it, so it's a standard shield from 250 to 550. But getting a 250 shield in the early game is huge. It's like having an extra barrier, by the way. And when the shield procs, you get an extra 8% physical vamp, bringing the total to 13% physical vamp. This item I think is actually quite underrated. A lot of ADCs complain about getting blown up or not having value. Immortal Shieldbow definitely helps out a lot. It helps a lot with 1v1s, right? If the enemies try to burst you and they suddenly can't, like an assassin tries to burst you and they suddenly can't, you can DPS them down and of course heal your health back with all the physical vamp. So the stats are really good. 40 attack damage and 15% attack speed they're okay, they're decent stats. It's nowhere near as much as like Bloodthirster would give, but they're decent stats for the price. So I think Immortal Shield Bow is a great first or second item. I wouldn't get it after that because the shield kind of falls off, right? Having a 250 shield in the early game is huge. Having a 550 shield in the late game is not that relevant. And like we talked about, if the enemies are building Serpent's Fang, not a great time to build Immortal Shield Bow. Also, if you already have a lot of shields and the enemies will likely build Serpent's Fang, maybe don't go Immortal Shield Bow first item because it just gets completely countered, right? But overall, you want to build this on ADCs, right? Because of the critical rate. So most ADCs that you don't want to get bursted on. It depends on what champions the enemies have as well. If they have assassins, then Immortal Shield Bow is better, right? If they have consistent damage dealers, then Immortal Shield Bow won't be as great. Moving on to Collector. This is probably the worst item in the game. I see this item build constantly while it's actually terrible. 10 armor penetration is not a lot, right? Yeoman's gives 15. Duskblade gives 18. It's this Serpent's Fang gives 15. So 10 is really not a lot. It gives you 80 in crit. So I see this build on champions that don't get crit very often, like Zed. You don't care about crit on Zed. You're not building the Collector, right? The few champions that this is good on, and it's good on very few champions, are in certain situations Draven, in certain situations Misfortune, and in certain situations Jhin. It's pretty much useless on every other champion, to be perfectly honest with you. The main reason that people build this item is that the execute gives them dopamine, but overall it's not good. It's good on crit champions that benefit from armor penetration, right? The cool thing about armor penetration is that it works on abilities, on physical damage abilities, right? Yes, it works on auto attacks, but it also works on abilities. So let's say you're playing Caitlyn, right? You're mostly auto attacking. Yeah, you have your first ability, but you're mostly auto attacking. The critical rate is great, the armor penetration not that great, right? The stats it gives are terrible. 40 AD and 25% crit chance for 2900, it's an absolute ripoff, right? If you look at Immortal Shield Bow, for example, right? Same stats, but it also gives 5% vamp, another 8% on your passive, and of course the giant shield, and it gives better stats already. So I don't know how people can justify buying the Collector other than the dopamine. 25 gold is nothing, it's less than a minion. So the 5% execute is pretty much nothing. Like the situations where an enemy is 5% and they survive, like you don't end up killing them, just they're so rare that they don't exist. Like just do one more auto attack. Anyway, this item is complete trash and needs to get buffed. Stop building it, please. Stop showing me. I see some people sending me their builds and they have Collector. Like just stop building it. Even on the 3 champions that it's good at, it's very rarely good at, like 10% of situations. Like I would rather have a Jhin with Storm Razor Magnetic that can use his utility and root people, or a Jhin that goes Bloodthirster, Infinity Edge, Mortal Reminder and actually does damage, than a Collector, which is good against very squishy champions. Collector is a terrible item, don't build it. Thank you. Clip that and send it to your friends that build Collector. Moving on with that's such a stupid name. Champunk Chainsword, which is the bruiser version of Mortal Reminder, because it gives HP, attack damage, and grievous wounds. The problem with this item is that Mortal Reminder is better in 99.9% of situations. So it gives 15 more AD, and it gives 250 health and 15 ability haste, right? And a paralyzed grievous wounds. But Mortal Reminder gives 33% armor penetration, which is huge, because let's say that the enemies have 200 armor, or even squishy champions usually have like 80 armor in the late game. Mortal Reminder is gonna eliminate 33% of that, which is a huge amount of damage. So if you're playing a bruiser, you usually prefer Mortal Reminder, and if you're playing a tank, of course you're not gonna go Champunk Chainsword, you're gonna go Thornmail, right? So it's in this weird situation where Mortal Reminder and Thornmail are both way better than it. Even in situations where you're playing a bruiser, because the stats it gives you are not great, you might just stick on Executioner's Calling. Even if you don't want Mortal Reminder, just buy Executioner's Calling until the super late game, and then you can get Mortal Reminder where everybody has a decent amount of armor just from the base armor that they get. And then you can just get Mortal Reminder instead of Champunk Chainsword. Boom, problem solved. right? So it's just such a piss useless item, to be honest. It just doesn't fit anywhere. Your better options are Thornmail, Mortal Reminder, or just sticking to Executioner's Calling until the super late game where you can get Mortal Reminder. I'm hoping it's buffed in the future. It's not a great choice for anything. Spear of Sojin is an unbelievably strong situational item. However, it's not for every champion. It gives really good stats. 300 max health is a lot, 50 AD is a lot, and 25 ability haste is a lot. Compare that to something like Infinity Edge, right, which gives 60 AD and 25 crit rate. Look how many more stats it gives, even with other bruiser items, right? Sunder Sky gives same health, 10 more AD, 10 more ability haste. 300 gold more expensive though. And it gives 5% movement speed. It's all about the passive. Champions that make good use of this item's passive are insane. So the best user of this item's passive is actually Corki, because his ulti is on a super low cooldown, and he can keep proccing it over and over again and not letting the item go on its 20-second cooldown. But every champion that can either proc it over and over again, like Riven with her ulti resets, or champions that rely on their ulti and they're really strong with their ulti, so you pretty much only fight with their ulti. Nasus is another good example of a champion that can benefit from this. But overall, any champion that uses a lot of abilities and benefits a lot from their ulti, so you fight with their ulti. Renekton, of course, is another very common example of a Spear of Sojin user that's really good, right? You ult with Renekton, and then having your abilities reduced by 25%. Is it 25%? Yeah, 25% for 10 seconds is insane. And of course, the movement speed is also super useful. The best example again is Corki, but it's really good on Renekton. Situationally on Nasus, because on Nasus usually one build tank. Situationally on Riven, because there's other items that Riven really likes. But in those situations where you want to fight with your ultimate and you benefit from these stats in particular, unbelievably good item. I pretty much always build on Corki. This is like third item, pretty much always on Corki. Terminus. So, Terminus gives 35 AD and 30% attack speed, which is quite low. It gives, like, we can compare it to an item like Blade of the Ruined King, right? And it's even more expensive. It's a really expensive item. Obviously, they've nerfed this item over and over again to put it in the state because it was just way too broken. So, every time you auto attack, you gain armor and magic resist. And then your next auto attack gives you armor pen and magic pen, right? And this does bonus magic damage on hit. So what does this item scream, right? It obviously screams mixed damage champion, right? Champions do a lot of a lot of physical and magic damage, benefit a lot from this item, especially if they make use of the attack damage and attack speed. The number one champion for this is, of course, Kai'Sa. Kai'Sa actually rushes this item, it's so good on her. It's an unbelievably good item on Kai'Sa and other mixed damage dealers. The problem is that other mixed damage dealers like Ezreal prefer spellcasting items more, right? And Ezreal in particular usually doesn't even really build an armor or magic pen item. He might go for Driftmaker to just increase his damage into true damage. He might go for Cirilla's Grudge because of the slow, right? So Terminus is kind of in this weird position where it doesn't fit many champions, but the champions it does fit, it's really good on. Like again, Kai'Sa. Varus is okay with this in certain builds. Obviously, you guys have seen me play like tank top, tank Varus, where Terminus is super good, right? But most of the time with Varus, you mostly go like spellcaster. You don't really go attack speed. But pretty much on any champion that does both physical and magic damage, which is not a lot, Terminus is it's a great choice because it reduces both armor and magic pen and also gives you armor and magic resist. So you would think that it would be in theory good on a champion like Yone, who fits his description, but the crit you get from Mortal Reminder is just better. Overall, a decent item. Don't particularly hate it. I think it's pretty good on its niches. So situationally good again. Eclipse. So Eclipse gives decent stats. 60 AD and 20 ability haste are pretty good. It covers a similar role as Duskblade, I would say. It's pretty much like you decide between Duskblade or Eclipse. Most champions that don't auto-attack prefer Eclipse. Something like a Zed that doesn't want to auto-attack even later in the game. Eclipse is great for, right? Because hitting an enemy with 2 separate attacks deal 6% of their max health, which is not really a lot. It's 3% if you're ranged, so you don't want to buy this on a ranged champion. Most of the time you're buying this on a melee champion. And you gain a shield of 140 plus 35% bonus damage. Again, on ranged staff, you don't want to get this on a ranged champion. And it's 6-second cooldown, so you can keep proccing it over and over again. It's a decent item on spellcast champions. The shield is very, very small. It's not going to be game changing. But on champions like Riven, champions like Kha'Zix, champions like Zed, they have an easy time proccing its passive while also not really auto-attacking, right? The problem with Duskblade is that you got auto-attack to get the bonus damage and the slow. So Eclipse just becomes like a better Duskblade almost. Obviously Duskblade gives the 18 armor pen, which is huge. Eclipse doesn't give that. So it's also a better answer into tankier champions because it does 6% of the target's max health. Well, of course, Eclipse is better, or Duskblade is better against squishier champions where the 18 flat armor penetration is going to be more useful. So that's kind of where Eclipse is at. The shield is tiny, so I don't think it's that good as a bruiser item. But if you're a bruiser against tanks, then I can see it, right? Playing a Bessa into a tanky team, playing Riven into a tanky team, then it can be good, but obviously you want to pair that up with some attack, some HP, some armor, so you don't get blown up by those tanks. And that's where Sunder Sky comes in. So Sunder Sky gives actually decent stats. Obviously they're not as high as items like Divine Sunder or Spear of Sojin, but for 2,900 gold, it's kind of a steal to get 300 HP, 40 AD, and 15 ability haste. And your first attack will do more damage, and it will also heal you, right? Most of the time you get this. It's similar to like Spellblade, even though it's not a Spellblade item, but your first attack will deal a lot of damage. And it will also restore health based on missing health and your attack damage. So the lower you are, the bigger your heal is going to be. So this is great on bruiser champions that want to stay in the fight longer. So again, champions like Riven benefit from this. Jax actually benefits from this too. Champions that do in theory make use of like Divine Sunder and Trinity Force also usually make good use of Sunder Sky. Also, it's pretty good on like burst champions if you're just gonna go and do a lot of damage early. So it's also good on champions like Mbessa. In terms of building this on a ranged champion, as you can see, it's one of the few bruiser items that doesn't have a bad like ranged issue, right? Like it doesn't nerf them for ranged champions. It's just overall not great in ranged champions because if you have like a lot of missing health, you're usually running away. Like if you're playing an ADC, you're not fighting on super low HP. However, it can situationally be okay on ranged champions as well. Overall, that's just a great bruiser item that gives damage, heals you. It's very useful in the 1v1. You can proc it on multiple enemies, right? So it's decent in team fights. You get a lot of healing. So it's a good choice. It's in a similar boat with Divine Sunder. They're both pretty good. A lot of times they're built together. Other champions that have like, and this also why I said it's really good on Jax, the 160% damage ideals works on empowered attacks. So it works on Garen first ability, it works on Jack's second ability, it will empower the base damage of that ability as well. And on Nasus it actually works too. On Nasus's first ability, it will, let's say you have 1,000 stacks, it will do 160% damage on those stacks. So Sunder Sky is like great item on those types of bruisers that have like a powerful ability that you can enhance the damage of as well, like an empowered attack, right? But mostly on bruisers, right? Stormrazor, we talked quite extensively about Stormrazor this entire time as I was going through the items, mostly with Magnetic Blaster, right? But it's pretty much an item that it does less damage than items like Bloodthirster, Infinity Edge, right? But its niche is the utility that you get from it. It's great for kiting, right? Being able to just attack the enemy champion once, have them slowed, and you gain movement speed is amazing. If you're playing like an ADC and you're trying to kite a Riven or trying to kite a Darius, right? Stormrazor can come in clutch. Of course, it works great with Magnetic Blaster. Another benefit is the slow. It gives a lot of utility and lets you land abilities. So if you're playing Jhin, for example, auto attack, second ability. Caitlyn is great because she can just proc it from a huge range and it doesn't let the enemies get near her because they're slow and she gains movement speed and then she can keep doing more auto attacks, right? So even though like with one auto attack, Infinity Edge or Bloodthirster would do more, Stormrazor allows you to get more auto attacks off, right? It's also a bit cheaper than those items and gives still decent stats, 40 AD, 20 attack speed, and 25% crit rate. I personally think it's a pretty good item right now. It did receive some nerfs a few patches ago to kind of balance out the movement speed, since it was really insane and pretty much every ADC was building it. But on utility champions and utility ADCs, I think can be super powerful, especially on champions that hate getting slowed, like Darius, like Garen, right? Like Sion, all those bruiser and tanky-esque champions. But obviously, you want to make sure that you have damage as an ADC. That's your primary goal. So that's where it kind of loses a few points. However, it can be okay in certain situations. Like I said, if you care about the utility more than the damage, Storm Razor is great, but you need to be making sure that you're building damage. So you still want to get Moral Reminder as your third item if you go Storm Razor Magnetic. Then, you know, Moral Reminder third. And those champions will often build Bloodthirster or Infinity Edge fourth. But yeah, I've pretty much said everything about Storm Razor at this point. I think it's a good item, obviously situational as well. Black Cleaver is similar to Trinity Force in the sense that they have the same Valor passive, right? It's called something different, it's called Rage on Black Cleaver, but you get that movement speed, which is nice. It gives decent stats for most bruisers. But what you build Black Cleaver for, it's the Sunder passive. Excuse me. Where dealing damage reduces the champion's armor. And this is different than armor penetration, it's armor reduction. So, what the difference is, when I'm auto attacking as a Caitlyn, armor penetration, I'm ignoring 33% of the champion's armor. With Black Cleaver, let's say that I attack a champion once, it reduces their armor by 6, so the rest of my team also has more damage against them because their armor was reduced, right? It's not just for me. So this is great on bruisers that can stack it up easily. So champions like Darius, champions like Riven, champions that can do Renekton, champions that can just pretty much stack it up really quickly. It's 4 times up to 24%. It's a good, again, because your whole team benefits from that 24% reduction. So especially if you have like a heavy AD team, it becomes even better. Stats are pretty good. The main issue with this item is that it's outshined by pretty much Trinity Force and Divine Sunder. And other bruiser items. Like, its main issue is that other bruiser items like the Sunder Sky, the Divine Sunder, the Trinity Force, even the Eclipse, other bruiser items are just a little better than it. However, it does have its niche, and again, when you have a lot of physically dealing champions, the enemies have a lot of armor, Black Cleaver can be really, really good. It has a lot of passive utility that you don't really see, because you reduce a lot of champions' armor, and that's not something you can really see or visualize because it's damage that you don't even deal yourself all the time. But in those situations, it can be super useful, especially with AoE abilities if you can, you know, do it on multiple champions. Like Darius' first ability, you hit all 5 of them, your bleed passive reduces all their armor. Actually, I think Black Cleaver is really underrated on Darius. The problem with Darius is that, again, you want to go Trinity Force so you can stack your passive quicker. And then you want to go Stairx Gauge so you don't die as quick. Death Stand so you don't die as quick. Other tank items so you don't die as quick. You can't really fit Black Cleaver. But those are pretty much the situations where it's good. Titanic Hydra gives 450 health and attack damage based on your bonus HP. So the more HP you have, the more damage Titanic Hydra will deal. The problem with Titanic Hydra is that it gets balanced around Heartsteel, which is an item that gives you a lot of HP, right? So the main issue that it has is that it gets balanced around must-have Heartsteel to build. So pretty much every champion that builds Titanic Hydra builds Heartsteel first. Something like a Mundo, a Sion, right? So it's been balanced around that. That's the main issue with Titanic Hydra. If Heartsteel gets nerfed in the future, I'm expecting some Titanic buffs. You can't really build without Heartsteel because you just don't get that much extra damage from it. But champions that do stack a lot of HP hugely benefit from Titanic Hydra. It gives them great wave clear with the cleave ability, and obviously gives them a bunch of AD. So a champion like Sion and Mundo that love AD and they love HP benefit a lot by Titanic Hydra, and of course it gives them better wave clear as well. Someone like Sett obviously benefits a lot from Titanic Hydra. But if you're not going to build Heartsteel, then it just gets outshined by all the other bruiser items like Sunder Sky, Black Cleaver, Stairx Gauge, Divine Sunder, and so on, right? Looking into the mid-tier items, I'm going to briefly talk about them as well. Tier, it's a bad item, it gives you no stats, it's only good for stacking mana immune. Obviously, you want to get it early just to stack it, but obviously this can give you a disadvantage in the early game. Sheen, terrible item, even with its passive, you're wasting 800 gold and getting no stats other than 10 ability haste, which is pretty much nothing. Overall, I kind of avoid building Sheen, even when I'm building Trinity Force. I will usually build Phage or Phage and Stinger before I go and start building Sheen. It's not worth it, the damage is not very high. Vampiric Scepter is actually great to get early on, especially if you're building Bloodthirster, because the 8% physical vamp is quite a lot on just 1200 gold and gives you great sustain. Zeal is actually a great item. Unfortunately, it only builds into one item, which is Magnetic Blaster. So despite actually being a good item that gives a movement speed, crit rate, and attack speed early on, even though the stats are not very high, it only builds in Magnetic Blaster, so you don't have to worry about it too much. This shard thing gives 50 damage, does the energize thing. It's 900 gold for 20% attack speed, which is not really worth it, kinda sucks. Noon Quiver, not very good stats for the price. Nashor's Talon, not great stats for the price. Serrated Dirk is actually great. Serrated Dirk is one of the few mid-tier items that are really good. I said that for Vampiric Scepter, right? Everything else kinda sucks, but Vampiric Scepter really good. Serrated Dirk really good. And this makes the items that build from these two even better, right? Because you have a good build path into them. You get good stats before you even get them. 20 AD and 8 armor penetration for 1000 gold is a really good deal. A lot of the time when you're building items like Duskblade or Yomu's, make sure that you prioritize the Dirk even over a completed Caulfield's Warhammer, because 25 AD and 10 ability haste is not as good as 20 AD and 8 armor penetration. Don't fall for the scam of it costs more gold, has to be better. Recurve Bow is actually pretty good. You get 15 on hit and 30% attack speed for 1400 gold. That's a good deal. Bloodthirster is actually really good as well. Again, it doesn't build into that many. Actually, it builds into 5 items, that's not bad. But 40 AD for 1500 gold is a good deal. Cloak of Agility is actually good too. 20% crit rate for 1000 is not a bad deal whatsoever, and builds into pretty much every crit item. Last Whisper is trash. 15% armor pen and 15 damage is just way too low for 1300 gold. Even when I build items like Mortal Reminder, I try to get like 2 long swords, which will give me like 24 damage overall instead of 15. And the crit as well. Executioner's Calling, insanely good item. For 800 gold you get 15 AD and Grievous Wounds, which is insane. Like, look at this, Nashor's Talon gives 20 AD and this gives 15 AD and for the same gold, and you also get the 40% Grievous Wounds. So Executioner's Calling, really good item. I recommend getting this when the enemies have anti-heal and just sitting on it, if you don't want to finish Mortal Reminder until later on. Phage, really good item. You get the Rage passive from Trinity Force and Black Cleaver, but for 1000 gold only, and you get max health and attack damage. Stinger, insanely good stats, right? Compared with Recurve, it gives 30% attack speed, this gives 30% and 10% ability haste for 200 less gold, but of course you don't get the passive. So both of these items are really good. Hexstringer, really good, 20 AD and 20 magic resist for 1100 gold, that's a great deal, right? This gives 12 AD for 500. And if we go to the magic resist, this gives 20 magic resist for 500. So for 100 extra gold, you get an extra 8 magic resist. Or an extra 8 AD, excuse me. Caulfield's Hammer, not very good. It gets gapped by Serpent's Dirk. Kindle Gem, not very good. You don't get that much HP, and the ability haste is not great as a stat on its own. Dream's Fist, decent. 200 HP and 15 AD for 1200. So, bad, good, really good, okay-ish, bad, really good, really good, bad, really good, okay, good, I guess, really good, bad, good. And obviously these are the basic items, don't really matter. I'm gonna take a small break for myself. Obviously you're not gonna say this because it's gonna get edited out, and then we're gonna jump straight into the magic items. Okay, I'm not 100% sure if I explained this properly, so I kind of want to explain it again when it comes to armor penetration. I explained armor shred versus percent armor penetration, but I didn't really touch on flat armor penetration, so here's how it works. 15 flat armor penetration on a target that has 100 armor will reduce 15, right? So during the damage calculation, it will take into account 85 armor. Percentage goes with percent. So if you have 100 armor, it will reduce 33% of that, which is 33. So they will have an effective 67 armor in the damage calculation, right? And again, Yomu's flat. So targets that have very little armor, flat armor penetration, like Yomu's, Duskblade, Collector, is more useful. And when enemies have a lot of armor, percent will be more useful. And the more armor they get, percent will of course apply to all that armor. However, in Wild Rift, even if they don't build armor, the base armor that champions get, excuse me, gets quite high. Even like the squishiest champions will have like 80 armor by endgame. So the 33% armor penetration is always gonna be better in the late game than the 10 flat armor penetration from the Collector. This is another reason why I think the Collector is a really bad item. Anyway, that was all I wanted to touch before we jump into the magic items, and there's a lot less of them, so hopefully the magic items will be a little quicker. Even though I know this is a very long video, I'm glad you guys are sticking by it. I'm sure you're learning a lot. So let's start off with Luden's Echo. So Luden's Echo is a great early game item. It helps with wave clear, and the base damage ideal is quite high, 110 base damage the moment you get it. It has a 10% AP scaling, which is pretty low overall, right? 10% is really low. Even if you have like 1000 AP, that's only 100 extra damage. But the base damage is quite high, so it's a great early game AP item. It gives 85 AP, which is quite a lot, 20 ability haste, and 300 max mana. Like I said, it's really good for wave clear. The issue with Luden's Echo are these boots of mana. Because boots of mana give you 150% mana regeneration, no champion really runs out of mana, except the ones that are super mana reliant. But those champions will usually, like Kassadin or Orianna, but those champions usually go Archangel Staff, right, for the tier to really get a lot of mana. So Luden's Echo is in the spot where most champions that in theory should build it, like Syndra, right, like Victor, just don't really like it because there's just better choices and they don't need the mana, so they can just focus on damage. So Luden's is in this weird spot where it's a great item, but the mana component of it is not really needed. The wave clear is still good. I consider Luden's to be a kind of an underrated item, to be honest, but it just doesn't have its place in the meta. The champions I want to build this item the most are usually poke champions. One champion that does still build Luden's is Ziggs. Obviously, he's the best poke champion in the game, right? Morgana can kind of build it as well. It helps with her second ability, get some extra damage out there, because her second ability takes time to do damage. So if you want to like finish someone off or just poke, Luden's helps out a lot. But those are pretty much just the use cases. It's been kind of downgraded to this poke item that most burst champions don't really want. They would rather go for like Infinity Orb or for Awakened Soul Stealer that gives very similar stats, but you also get the flat magic penetration, right? Lichbane, if the champion can abuse it, like Ahri, a lot of the time will actually not run Luden's and run Lichbane instead, or completely skip both and go for Infinity Orb right away. So Luden's it's a bit of a weird item in the current situation because of mana items not really being 100% needed anymore because of the Boots of Mana. However, yeah, it's mostly a poke and wave clear item. Hopefully in the future it finds its place, right? Next up we have Morellonomicon, which actually has decent stats for the price, right? 2600 gold, you get 150 HP, 75 mana, and 20 ability haste, and you get the Grievous Wounds. The main issue with Morellonomicon is that Grievous Wounds suck, and they especially suck on most mages or burst champions. AP champions are not consistent damage dealers, right? There's only a few consistent damage dealers, like Aurelion Sol, right? But those champions usually have like a build that they have to go. Like Aurelion Sol has to go like Rallies into like Riftmaker, Liandry's, Deathcap, right? Those types of items. So you can really afford Morellonomicon. Most AP champions are burst champions, right? They do damage with their abilities. So when you have a burst champion, healing reduction is not that useful, right? If I'm playing Syndra, I will either one-shot someone or I won't. If I don't one-shot them, it doesn't matter if they heal after because I don't have any more spells. So Grievous Wounds in general is just not great for most AP champions. It can still be good, especially on a champion like Teemo, for example, because his poison obviously keeps Grievous Wounds for longer than 3 seconds. But overall, I don't think Mortal Gun is a very good item. I would avoid gaining on mages, and if the enemies, or in most AP champions, and if the enemies have a lot of healing, I would encourage my team to get Mortal Reminder or Thornmail. That are way better options. However, if it's really needed and the enemies do have generally a lot of healing, like a Soraka or even a Mundo, and no one in your team can build anti-heal, then you can go for Mortal Omicron, but I'm not a big fan of the item. However, what is nice about it is that the stats are actually pretty good for the price. Moving on, Death Cap. This is a must-get item for pretty much every AP champion. Second, third, or worst case scenario, fourth. It's most often taken as the third item, but worst case scenario, you must get as your fourth item. But I would recommend getting it as your third usually, and some champions even get it as their second item. It pretty much just increases your AP by 20 to 45%. So the more AP that you already have, the more your AP is going to be increased. And it's just a huge power spike for any AP champion that has decent AP scalings. And it does depend on your champion's AP scalings, right? Fizz, Echo have really high AP scalings, so they love getting Rabadon's second or third item. Some champions that have lower AP scalings don't necessarily need Rabadon's right away, like if their base damage is really high, but pretty much every champion gets as a third item, worst case situation, fourth item. Moving on to Rallies. I want you to notice something with Rallies, right? 350 HP, 70 AP, but what is missing? Every single other AP item has 7% magic penetration, and when you get 5 items, you get a total of 35% magic penetration. Back in the day, we had an item that did that, Void Staff. However, it was removed, and ever since they removed it, every single AP item has the 5% magic damage penetration, except Runans, Nashor's Tooth, and Rylai's. So that's the main issue that Rylai's has. It lacks that 7% magic penetration. So stat-wise, it's quite a weak item. Like even compared to Morellonomicon, right? It gives 200 more HP, loses 5 AP, and doesn't have the 20 ability haste, excuse me. And of course, it doesn't have the 7% magic penetration. So it's quite weak in terms of stats. But of course, it makes up with its passive, which is only useful in a limited amount of champions. And that's champions that can continuously do damage so that they can keep applying the 1 second slow, right? It's very similar to Sherilda's Grudge. But there aren't that many champions that can do that. It's really good on Aurelion Sol because he can keep applying it with his first ability. It's good on Singed because he can keep applying it with his poison. And that kind of is the list. I'm sure I'm missing a couple of champions that also utilize Rallies. So it's a decent item, however it's very, very niche. And because it lacks that 7% magic penetration, its gold value is just low, right? The stats you get for how much it costs is just usually not worth it. Moving on to Liandry's. Liandry's is a good item, especially in the late game. However, again, then there aren't that many good users of it. The best user of it, again, is Teemo and Aurelion Sol because they can keep doing damage. The damage you get from it is actually decent. Oh, Zyra and Heimerdinger, those are some other good users of Rallies because of their plants and their turrets, right? And that makes them good users of Liandry's too, because they can keep kind of applying that burn a lot easier. It's been nerfed for the early game. You only get 0.4% over 3 seconds. So that's 1.2% of max health damage, which is not a lot, but it does have an AP scaling. So if you have like 1000 AP, let's use an extreme example, you're gonna be doing an extra, what is it? Oh, with 100 AP, you're doing an extra 0.5. So with 1000 AP, you're doing an extra like 15% of the enemy's health. This is really good on champions that can continuously proc it. Lilia passive is another example, right? So on champions like that, it's really, really good. Rumble, for example, can keep rocking with his first ability, and the turrets and so on. It's a great late game item, and it completely shreds tanks. However, most AP champions are more focused on burst, right? Again, this more consistent DPS item, which most AP champions don't want to do. However, there are a few exceptions. So again, Leandries is situationally strong. When do you want to build Leandries? Obviously, if your champion wants to build Leandries, that's the main thing. Like if you're playing a Lilia, a Zyra, a Heimerdinger, a Teemo, those champions love Leandries, even Singed. However, if you're playing a champion like Ziggs, Syndra, right, a more burst champion, Veigar, I think it's okay on Orianna, but if you're playing a burst champion, Leandries, you can maybe get as a last item if the enemies are very tanky, but overall you should stay away from it. Moving on to Rod of Ages. Rod of Ages gives you, it's the most stat efficient item in the game pretty much. Obviously there's exceptions, like Deathcap can be more stat efficient depending on how much AP you have, but it's an insanely stat efficient game, item, where you get 250 HP, 60 AP, and 300 mana. And it has the passive that when you use mana you get healing, and when you get hit you gain mana. But the main passive is Veteran, which gives you every 40 seconds a stack up to 10 stacks, and each stack gives you 25 health, 10 mana, and 6 AP. That means that a fully stacked Rod of Ages, which takes like, what is it? 6-7 minutes to stack, so I think 6 minutes 30 seconds, something like that. You gain 500 health, 120 AP, and 400 mana, right? No AP item gives 500 health, right? The highest one is Rallies with 350, I think. Even Psychic Projector, which is the tank item, only gives 300 HP. Rod of Ages gives 500 HP and 120 ability power. No AP item gives 120 ability power. Even Deathcap gives 100 without the passive, right? Archangel is close to it. We'll talk about Archangel in a minute. So the stats it gives are insane. The problem with it is that it, first of all, doesn't really have a real passive. It's just stats. Eternity, where you gain a bit of health back and a bit of mana back, it's just not a good passive, right? And every other AP item, from what you're seeing, has a very strong passive. This is one of the reasons why Morello and Omicron is pretty weak too, because just Grievous Wounds, right? Ludens does an extra 110 damage. Deathcap, of course, has the most broken passive in the game. Rylai's has a slow that you can keep applying. Leandries has a burn. Lichbane, great passive. Crown, great passive. Infinity Orb, great passive. So while it's a great stat item, it doesn't have a great passive to really help you out. And it's designed to be a first item, right? So you can stack it quickly, right? When you have more time. So it's designed to be a first item, but if you get Rod of Ages and your enemy has a Luden's Echo or even Infinity Orb, they're just gonna be out damaging you and be more useful on that one item power spike. So it's a great scaling item, and it's niche. A lot of champions can build it. The main champion that builds it is obviously Kassadin. I actually think it's quite an underutilized item, especially since the durability change. I think Rod of Ages is particularly good and underutilized by most champions. Obviously, Kassadin is the prime example of somebody who builds it, and Eternity actually kind of works great with him because of how much mana he uses. He can keep getting 25 health every cast, pretty much, on his ulti, and so on. So it's okay on Kassadin, because again, stat machine. However, that's the main issue of it. Most mages and most AP champions in general don't really like health, and the ones that do, like Lilia, are kind of forced to build Riftmaker, Leandries. It's too slow to build Rod of Ages. And the other problem the Rod of Ages has, it doesn't have ability haste either. So it doesn't feel great as a first item, since you're not going to have enough damage like you would with an Infinity Orb to just one-shot champions. And you don't have enough ability haste to keep doing multiple combos like you would with Ludens, or even Awakened Soulstealer Rush, or even Riftmaker Rush. So that's the main issue he has, but I think it's underutilized. Obviously it's great on champions like Kassadin, but it's great on most AP fighters. And most AP late game champions. However, you are giving up a lot, and it's not that Rod of Ages isn't good, it is good. It's just every other item is better, and they all have really good passives. Like Lichbane. A lot of champions that could in theory build Rod of Ages prefer Lichbane Rush. Like the Echo, like the Fizz, right? Champions that keep fighting. So what makes Lichbane so good? Lichbane gives decent stats, not amazing for its price, but 80 AP, 10 ability haste, and the 5% movement speed is really nice. But the main reason you get it is Spellblade, similar to Trinity Force and Divine Sunder. Your next auto attack after an ability, and it works with empowered attacks, gets bonus magic damage up to 75% of your base and 50% of your AP. So if you have 500 AP, it will do an extra 250 damage, which is an insane amount. If you have 1000 AP, it's an extra 500 damage. So this pairs really well with empowered abilities like Echo's third ability, like Fizz's first ability, Kassadin's second ability. A lot of empowered abilities really benefit from Lichbane because it gives them an extra 50% scaling. So Echo's third ability, I believe, has a 40 or 50% AP scaling. Now it has a 90 or 100% AP scaling. It's a decent first item for those champions that have empowered attacks, but it's also a great late game item for some other champions. I've seen Lichbane Ari, right, to do a combo, to do an ult, second ability, do her combo and drop an auto attack in there. Ari likes to drop an auto attack in there, especially in early game trades. So it can be good on other champions too. However, most of the time you're going to build it on champions with an empowered ability. Victor is another great example, right? It increases the AP scaling on his first ability because he auto attacks. So that's its main purpose. It's mostly like a burst item for those champions that have empowered abilities. Archangel Staff is next. So Archangel Staff again has the same issue that Ludens has, which is most AP champions don't care about mana. And I guess Rod of Ages also has this problem. Like the 400 mana is just not useful in a lot of champions, right? Because Boots of Mana is so good at keeping you mana healthy. And of course you have the runes as well. The Honey Fruit runes. And the Stylic Sea Jar that lets you get another Honey Fruit, and you just go from 0 mana to 100 mana just like that, like 100% mana just like that. Where Archangels just doesn't feel worth it for a lot of champions. Notable exceptions are Orianna, that uses a huge amount of mana just spamming her first ability over and over. Kassadin, of course, this is the item for Kassadin because she's just the most mana hungry champion in the game. So in those cases, if your champion is extremely mana hungry, Archangels is pretty good. It pairs up nicely with Rod of Ages too, because it pairs up nicely with other mana items. Since similar to Mana Immune for AD, it converts AP, or it converts mana into AP. So you get 1200 just from the Seraph's Embrace, and 3% of that gets converted to AP. And that is, let's say 1200, right? Plus the base 1000 that most champions have, around there. Right, so you have 2200 times 0.03. And that gives you 66 AP. So most champions in the late game will have 66 AP just from the Seraph's passive, plus the 35 base that you get. That's 100 AP, right? So just the Seraphs by itself and your base mana will give you 100 AP. Obviously pretty much unlimited mana, 20 ability haste, and you'll get this awesome shield when you're below 35 HP, which can help you survive longer. So it's great on champions that are mana hungry. However, it's gonna make your early game quite a bit weaker, especially compared to items like Ludens that people don't usually even build, right? Like compare Infinity Orb to this. You just have your Archangels, right? You're in Orianna, you finish Archangel's first item, and the enemy Ari has a finished Infinity Orb, right? She's gonna be out damaging you by a lot. It has 15 flat armor penetration, 85 AP, while Archangels has 35 AP and just 20 ability haste and pretty much no passive. You're just stacking the tier. So it's super weak in the early game, however it's a great late game option. You pretty much only go Archangels if you really have mana issues though. Otherwise it's definitely not worth it. Next up, we have the AP version of Nashor's Tooth. Obviously, as you guys know, when you buy Nashor's Tooth, it will either be AD or AP depending on how much AD or AP you already have. So this is a very niche item for AP champions because there aren't that many AP champions that want to auto attack a lot. There's two notable exceptions. One of them is Teemo, which I don't think Nashor's Tooth is very good on Teemo whatsoever, to be honest. After playing more and more games with Teemo, obviously I'm one of the better Teemos. I play the champion a lot and I'm really good with him. I prefer going for items like Liandry's, which is mandatory on Teemo pretty much, and you can choose between Riftmaker versus tanks and Infinity Orb versus squishies. You just don't get that many auto attacks that it feels like it makes Nashor's Tooth worth it. Even though it does have a nice 25% AP scaling on your auto attacks. The main issue with it is, again, you're similar to Rylai's, you're lacking that 7% magic penetration. And at the same time, Wild Rift is a game where you don't get that many auto attacks, especially not on AP champions. The fights end too quickly. So it's not great on Teemo either. One notable exception of a champion that loves using Nashor's Tooth is Fizz and Echo in the jungle. Because Fizz and Echo in the jungle need to clear their jungle camps fast, Nashor's Tooth is the best way to do that because of how much extra damage you get when each auto attack. It allows you to just be really, really strong in clearing your jungle in the early game. And of course, their combos also feel a lot smoother with Nashor's Tooth. So Nashor's Tooth is this niche item that you pretty much only want to get on Fizz and Echo jungle for right now. Obviously things can change, but again, niche item only on auto attacking AP champions. And even then, there's usually better options. Like Teemo is an obvious example. Infinity Orb. I think Infinity Orb is one of the more overrated items in Wild Rift. However, its damage is just insane, right? Especially its burst damage. So let's break it down. 85 flat AP, 7% magic penetration. Not good stats whatsoever, right? Like, Lichbane gives 80 AP, and even that gives 10 ability haste and movement speed. I guess this gives you movement speed too. But Lichbane is an item that, again, doesn't have great stats. If you compare it to Lichbane, or Morellonomicon, you pay 300 more gold and you get 10 more AP, but you don't get the HP and you don't get the 20 ability haste. But Infinity Orb has a really, really strong passive, and that's Demise. Your abilities and power attacks critically strike for 20% bonus health against enemies 35% health or below. So let's say you drop a Ziggs Bomb that's gonna do 300 damage, right? And if they're below 35% HP, that 300 damage is gonna get a 20% boost, and it's gonna do 360 damage. You just add an extra 60 damage. So it's great for finishing off targets, and the 15 magic penetration, flat magic penetration, is an insanely valuable stat. And that's because most champions don't really get a lot of base magic resist. So squishy champions that don't build any magic resist are very, very vulnerable to Infinity Orb. And if you pair that up with Awakened Soul Stealer, that's 30 flat magic pen. And Boots give you 38 flat magic pen. By the time champions have 2 items, very few champions have above 40 magic resist, base magic resist. So you're almost doing true damage to them. So flat magic penetration is extremely useful. And that makes Infinity Orb pretty much the best burst item in the game. Pretty much the meta before the durability patch was rush Infinity Orb, get Death Cap on every AP champion. And your damage would just be so high, so absurdly high. After the durability patch, it's been slightly nerfed. People still love building it, but it's definitely a lot weaker now in my opinion. And it gets very easily countered by the enemies just getting some magic resist and not fighting when they're super low, right? However, it still has its place as like one of the best burst items. So if the enemy is squishy or you're playing a champion that's focused on burst, like Syndra, like even Veigar, like assassins like Fizz, Echo, right? Infinity Orb definitely has its place. Moving on, Crystalline Reflector. Oh, other great burst champions by the way, Akali, Katarina, and so on. Moving on to Crystalline Reflector, which 200 HP, 40 armor, 70 AP, 7% magic penetration. Great stats for 3000 gold. Really good stats. Like, just compare this to Morellonomicon or even to Infinity Orb, and to any item pretty much. The stats it gives you are really good. However, the passive is a little underwhelming. It blocks 8 to 25 incoming physical damage, which is really low. And the damage it does back is 10 plus 3% AP plus 1% bonus HP. Like, you see what this item goes for, right? It's meant to be used for AP bruisers to kind of counter physical damage. However, the passive is just so weak that why would you even go Crystalline Reflector when you can go Rod of Ages? Or why would you go Crystalline Reflector? You might as well give up the 70 AP and just go for a tank item, you know? That actually has decent passives. So that's the main issue with Crystalline Reflector. I still think it's a good item because the stats are pretty good. So in niche cases, especially when the enemies are like full AD. But even then, there's like an argument to be made to just get steel plated caps or plated steel caps instead of going for the crystalline reflector. But I definitely see its niche spot in certain situations where the enemies are overwhelmingly heavy in armor, in physical damage, excuse me. Crystalline reflector can be a good answer for a lot of AP champions, especially AP champions that go in. So something like a Diana or a Neko can definitely benefit from this if the enemies are full AD. Moving on to Crown of the Shattered Queen, one of the most toxic and OP items in the game. So Crown has 60 AP. This item has been nerfed countless times and it's still one of the strongest items in the game. So 60 AP, some mana, 20 ability haste. But what it's like known for is its insane spell shield. So first of all, it blocks the first upcoming attack. Similarly, how we talked about Edge of Night, right? It blocks the next attack. But what's even better about Crown is that for the next second, 40% of the damage somebody deals to you is reduced. So let's say you're playing against a Rengar or a Katarina or a Zed, a champion that does all their damage like instantly in the beginning. I guess Zed has a bit of a delay because of his ulti damage. But champions that do a lot of their damage at the beginning, mostly Assassin and other burst champions, like Pantheon, right? He jumps on you, stuns you. First of all, he can't stun you because you block the first ability, but then you also block their damage. It's just an insanely safe item for most mages, or even like pretty much every AP champion gets this as like a third or fourth or fifth item, right? The value you get from the spell shield, but also damage reduction is absolutely insane. Like I jump in with Kassadin with this item, I block one spell. For a second, I'm like 40% more tanky, and then my ulti's back up and I can back off, you know? It's just unbelievably strong passive. So when you do have the safeguard up, you also get an additional 20 AP. So this helps long-range champions that their crown doesn't break easily, like a Ziggs or an Orianna, or a Syndra or any long-range champion, right? And what's even more awesome is that unlike, it's a 40-second cooldown, but unlike Edge of Night, you don't need to wait the whole 40 seconds. Because every time you deal magic damage to an enemy champion using an active ability, you reduce the cooldown by 4 seconds. So this is one of the strongest AP items. You pretty much build this on every champion, especially against assassins or burst. Cosmic Drive, this is a very niche item. There's only a few champions that build it. I've seen it on Vladimir, some Oriannas build it. The stats are okay. It gives 75 AP and 30 ability haste, as like compared to Luden's Echo, which gives 85 AP and 20 ability haste. It gives 5% movement speed. And now what's interesting about this item is the passive. It gives you a lot of movement speed. So your active abilities and powered attacks give you 30 plus 70% ability haste, which is usually going to be around, just this item alone gives like another 20. So you're going to get 50 movement speed just from this item, even without other ability haste, but the movement speed decays. So you gain 50 on the first like half 0.01 seconds, but then that decays to 0 within 2 seconds. So it's definitely an interesting item that helps a lot with movement speed and kiting. It's just very niche and not a lot of AP champions really benefit from this, right? Imagine you're Orianna, right? Who's a champion that actually does build Cosmic Drive a lot of the time. What's more useful? Doing an extra 20% bonus damage on champions under 35 HP, or getting like 50 decaying movement speed over 2 seconds when you damage a champion. It's not like Youmuu's where you have it permanently running around the map, right? It's when you damage a champion. Like, just get rallies and slow them by 30%, which is going to be more than 50, right? It just doesn't really make sense for most champions. I feel like if they added some HP to Cosmic Drive, I could see it being more useful, similar to how they have in PC League. But in its current state, it's just too niche of an item that you will very occasionally build on a few champions. Moving on to Riftmaker. This is one of the strongest items in the game, and I'll explain why. So the stats, first of all, are really good. You gain some health, which is always nice when you play AP champions that don't often get health from their items. 80 AP is pretty good, and 15 ability haste is pretty good. Better stats than an item like Luden's, for example, right? You gain 11% Omnivamp, which is the only AP item that actually gives you healing. So obviously some sustain is always nice, but it's passive that's really insane. So when you're in combat, you gain 1 stack every second, up to 3 seconds. Each stack increases the damage that you deal by 2.5 out of your 3 stacks, and at maximum stacks, the additional damage becomes 2 damage, which means that let's say that you have an ability that does 100 damage and you can use it every second. You use your ability 100 damage. The next one is going to be 2.5% more, 102.5 damage. The next one is going to be 105 damage. The next one is going to be 107.5 damage. But max stacks, that 7.5 damage becomes true damage. And what's really interesting about this is that it's pre-mitigation damage, which means most champions will do, let's say, 100 damage with their ability, right? And then magic resist will come into play. And 60% of that, let's say they have a lot of magic resist, right? And that 100 the damage gets reduced to 60 damage, right? Riftmaker, when he does the extra 7.52 damage, is not gonna count the 60 damage after the magic resist. It's gonna count the 100 damage before the magic resist. So it's still gonna do 7.5 damage, right? Instead of 7.5% of 60. So that means that it doesn't matter how much magic resist the enemies get, the true damage from Riftmaker will always be the same on every champion that you hit, and even if they have 100 magic resist or 300 magic resist. And that makes it an insanely strong item against pretty much any type of champion, but especially champions that get magic resist. This is obviously really good if you do longer fights, so it's not great on burst champions, but on champions, it's actually good on some burst champions like Akali, right? Because Akali does her ult, she hides in her shroud, she does her little combo, first ability in and out with her passive, so you are able to get the stacks pretty easily. But it's insanely good on champions that stay in fights longer. So even a champion like Orianna, even a champion like Lilia, obviously Lilia is amazing with Riftmaker, it works great with her passive. Teemo is great with Riftmaker, it works with his passive. So any AP champion that stays in fights a little longer, Riftmaker is absolutely amazing on. Moving on to Ocean's Trident. This is the Serpent's Fang equivalent for AP champions. However, it's a lot stronger on AP champions in my opinion, and that's first of all because it applies on abilities, right? And AP champions have a lot of AoE abilities that they can use it on. It does get a decrease on area of effect. It's only 25% instead of 40% base. But if you have enough AP, it gets capped at 45% if it's AoE. It helps a lot of burst champions, so pretty much every AP champion is burst almost. But a burst mage like Syndra, Veigar, an assassin like Hadrina, Akali, all of them really benefit from Ocean's Trident to counter shields, and the stats it gives are absolutely insane. It gives 50 more AP than Morello, 5 more AP than Morello, and you lose 10 ability haste. Instead of the Grievous Wounds passive that I explained was not very useful on most burst champions because either you killed them or you didn't with your abilities. It doesn't matter if they heal after. With Ocean's Trident, it does make a difference because enemies will shield when you do your damage. So being able to destroy that shield or have it not affect your damage as much does make a big deal. Obviously, I would never recommend getting this in your first 2 to 3 items. Maybe you can get it as a 3rd or 4th item, but I would pretty much say, as a rule of thumb, always get it after Rabadon's. Because Rabadon's is always going to give you more damage than Ocean Tridents will, even if the enemies have a lot of shielding. So, if you're going to go first item, Awakened or Lunan's Echo, second item, Rabadon's, third item, Crown, then get fourth item, Ocean's Trident. It's an item you're going to get usually later into the game. Moving on to Horizon's Focus, this is a very niche item. However, I think it can be very, very good in the right situations. The stats it gives are not great. It just gives 80 AP and 20 ability haste. So again, compared to like an item like Ludens, which gives 5 more AP and obviously gives them mana as well. The stats are not great, but the passive can be insanely good on a few champions. So if you damage a champion with an ability from 600 units away, so a little further than most champions auto attack, to get an understanding of how much 600 units is. It reveals them for 6 seconds and increases damage dealt to them by 9%. But that's not just you, that's your teammates as well. So let's say I'm playing Ziggs and I do an ult across the map, hit someone, my teammates will do 9% more damage to that target that I hit. So this works great on Ziggs. Lux is another example. I think it's underutilized on Lux. Karma can build this, especially as a support, to just increase her team's damage with her empowered first abilities. I think the main champion that really loves this item is Ziggs, and I think it's really good on Morgana mid too. So it's a very, very niche item. However, I personally think it's really good in the few use cases that you can make it work. It's just most champions, again, it's competing against other really, really good items, so it's hard to make it work for most champions. And on top of that, it also gives you vision. It gives a lot of vision. So this is why I like it on Ziggs too. You throw your first ability, you hit an enemy champion, and all enemy champions within 1,200 units, which is like 2 ranges of your auto attack, or a little more than that. Most auto attack ranges are like 550. You see everyone, and that's every 15 seconds. So it's great for vision as well from long range poke. Moving on, Psychic Projector. This is a unique and interesting item, which is meant to make tanky champions that have AP scalings do get more AP, right? The stats are good. 300 max health, 60 AP, 15 ability haste, and you gain ability power equal to 3% of bonus health. So, because it's bonus health and not health in general, it's kind of not that great, right? Like, let's say you only get Psychic Projector, right? That's 300 health, right? 3% of 300, should know this off the top of my head, but I don't, so I'm just gonna Google it. It gives 9, right? So 300 health will just give you 9 AP, which is not a lot. It's gonna go up to 69 AP but on its own. But if you pair it with items like Leandries, Riftmaker, Crystalline Reflector, or even tank items like the Heartsteel, then it becomes more lucrative. So I think it's an okay AP option for these tankier champions. Sometimes I'll get it on Kassadin, especially if I've gone Rod of Ages, which will give me 500 HP. I've seen it build on Vlad a lot of the time because his passive naturally gives him a lot of AP. But the projection passive, the shielding passive, every 3 seconds you pretty much get a shield for 10% AP and 5% bonus health. And for ranged champions, that shield is equal to 60% of its value, so it's not that useful in ranged champions, but overall the shield is just tiny. Like 30 base with 10 AP and 5 bonus health is just, it never even gets to 100. The shield is a joke. So the only real place that has an item is if you have a lot of bonus HP, then you can build it to convert a lot of that into AP, and the stats make it kind of worth it. But it's the same issue that Crystalline Reflector has, where the passive is just so weak compared to other passives. Like, imagine, just look at the shield, like the overall shielding you're gonna get from this item will never be anywhere near enough how much damage that crown is gonna reduce, right? So how would you ever get this over this? The only reason you would get Psychic Projector over crown is if you already have a lot of HP and you want to make use of it and convert some of it to AP. Moving on to Awakened Soulstealer, which is another magic penetration burst item. However, this item also gives ability haste, so it's a great first item choice for champions that want to get some ability haste to clear waves quicker, do more spell rotations, etc. So every time you take down an enemy within 3 seconds of damaging them, your ability cooldowns are reduced by 25%. That includes your ultimate, by the way, and then you steal 10% of their base movement speed, which is usually most champions in Wild Rift will have around 340 to 360 movement speed. Maybe 360 is too much. Around 340 to 350, around there. So you steal 10% of that, so you're gonna get like 35 movement speed for 10 seconds, and 50% of their ability haste. So most champions are gonna have like 40, maybe 30 to 50 ability haste. So you're gonna get 50% of that, which again, it's pretty nice. And it stacks the ability haste. So if you kill multiple enemies, you're gonna keep getting more and more ability haste, and all your cooldowns are also reduced by 25%. So you can just really take over fights quite quickly, right? You definitely take over fights quite quickly once you start getting kills with Awakened Soulstealer. The stats are decent. You get 150 HP, 20 ability haste, and of course the 50 magic penetration, as I mentioned, super important stat. Overall, this item is really good. It's pretty much better than Infinity Orb in most cases, but it's not gonna do as much burst damage as Infinity Orb. The nice thing about it is that it's a nice in between, because you also get HP and ability haste, right? You're not just committing to full damage, and it's a great cleanup item because of the passive. You pretty much want to get this when you're looking to have stronger team fights and stronger cleanup in team fights. Champions that have really strong ultimates as well love this item, because you can reduce the cooldown of your ultimate by 25% every time you get a takedown, which obviously is pretty massive. Honestly, wish that we had Karthus in this game from lolPC. He would love Awakened Soul Stealer. But these are the situations. It's like a core item pretty much on most AP champions. Like if you don't know what to get, Awakened Soul Stealer is usually a good choice on most AP champions. Even champions that don't like super benefit from it or benefit from other items like Lilia will often go for Awakened Soul Stealer just because of how strong the passive is and how good the stats are, right? Moving on to Runin's Hurricane. So this item now gives 40 AP, 35% attack speed, somewhat similar stats to Nashor's Tooth, and they fulfill a similar role. You're pretty much never building this on any AP champion. The only AP champion that will ever build this is Teemo, but even then it's not even as good as Nashor's Tooth, and even Nashor's Tooth is not that good. So this item is just not very useful for any AP champions, or at least full AP champions. Again, it can be good on champions like Kai'Sa, right, which can kind of be considered somewhat AP. But overall, you're not really building this on any mage, right? It only works on ranged champions as well. Another item that probably should be considered upgraded, but it's in mid-tier, and that's Magi Soul Stealer. It gives terrible stats. For 1,800 gold, you get 70 HP and 25 AP. But of course, Magi's is all about its passive. And he has the potential to go up to 175 AP for only 1,800 gold. Which is absolutely insane, right? I actually think Magi is quite a strong item on the right champions. I recommend never building this on any melee champions, because you only gain 3 stacks for each kill, when for ranged champions you gain 4 stacks. So I recommend only building this on ranged champions, and especially very safe ranged champions. Very safe ranged champions include champions like Orianna, right? Champions like Vladimir, maybe Syndra, right? If you can build it on these AP hungry champions that really want AP, but are also very safe and you won't really die with. Lux is another good example, right? Then it can be really good and you can completely take over games. I personally think it's a really good item. You just have to play around it very well. You gain so much AP, and the 10% bonus movement speed that you get at 10 stacks is also like an insane amount, right? That's combined Infinity Orb with Lich Bane. It's gonna give you like 30, 35 extra movement speed. It's really, really good. We're going through the rest of the mid-tier items. Similar to AD, I'm gonna go quite quickly on these. Tier, useless item, but you need to start stacking Archangels, right? It pretty much gives you infinite mana too. Aether Wisp, you never really want to be building this, even when I'm building Lich Bane. Like, I'll try to get the 2 Amplifying Tomes first, then even Sheen, and then Aether Wisp. But both Sheen and Aether Wisp are pretty weak. That's also another reason why Lich Bane is not as good as it could be. Compared to Infinity Orb, the build path kind of sucks, while Infinity Orb has a really good build path because of this item, Prophet's Pennant, which we'll talk about when we get to it. Lost Chapter, not that great. You don't really care about the mana most of the time because you have Boots of Mana, and it's only 30 AP. Phoenix Codex, decent, 35 AP, 10 ability haste, so it goes bad, 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 good. Blasting Wand, bad, 800 gold for 40 APs, like, it's okay. I would say it's okay. Like, they did buff it, it used to be 900 gold. 800 gold, it's okay. It's not bad, it's okay. So bad, 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 good, okay, bad. 60 AP for 1,500 gold is an absolute scam. If you look at Amplifying Tome, you can buy 3 Amplifying Tomes and have 75 AP. And Needlessly Large Rod gives you 60 AP. So, scam. Right? Builds into Death Cap. Such a joke, by the way. Like, when I build Death Cap, I build 3 Amplifying Tomes and then finish the Blasting One and the Needlessly Large Rod. Hunting Guys, Scam, again, 30 AP and 100 HP for 900 gold. You get 25 AP just from an Amplifying Tome. Catalyst, Scam kind of. The eternity passive can be pretty good for sustaining lane, but overall the stats it gives you are not worth 1100 gold. Sheen, Scam. Oblivion Orb is actually decent. You get 35 AP, so you get like 5 less AP than Blasting One. It's 100 gold more, but you get the Grievous Wounds. The problem with Oblivion Orb is that it used to be a great choice to just sit on Oblivion Orb as an AP champion, but the problem is that you're wasting 900 gold not completing an item when every item gives 7% magic penetration. So by not completing an item and wasting 900 gold, you're missing out on that 7% magic penetration. This is why I usually stay away from Oblivion Orb, and if you do get it, you might as well finish the Morella with 1,500 more gold to get that 7% magic penetration as well. Seeker's Armor is actually decent. 30 armor and 25 AP is quite good for 1,200 gold. The issue is that it only builds into Crystalline Reflector, which again is a shit item. Prophet's Pendant, great. This item is OP. For 1,000 gold, you get 12 flat magic penetration and 30 AP. So compared to like Infinity Orb, right, for the stats, it costs 3 times as much, and you only get 3 magic penetration and 55 more AP for 2,000 more gold. So let's say that you could get 3 Prophet's Pendants, for example. You get 90 AP and 36 magic penetration. It would be the best item in the game if it existed. If you could just get 3 of these. But unfortunately in Wild Rift, you can only buy 1 item at a time. You have to finish the Infinity Orb before buying another Prophet's Pendant. But Prophet's Pendant is like the most broken AP item, by the way. The stats he gives for the price are crazy. And he also makes both of these items feel pretty good to build, because you can sit on Prophet's Pendant. Hextech Alternator, this item is actually okay if you get it as like a first item when building into Riftmaker. The stats he gives are pretty mediocre, but every 20 seconds doing an extra 25 to 60 damage is pretty decent for trades in lane, I'm not gonna lie. Forbidden Idol, this should be with the supports. I don't know why it's in Magic. It's kind of bad. 900 gold. Like, it's good on like Soraka maybe, but it's kind of bad. Nashor's Tooth. This Nashor's Talon is actually like a little better for AP than it is for AD, because you get 40 AP. When Blasting Wand was 900 gold, it was kind of funny. This item gave the same amount of AP, but for less gold. But now they're the same, so it's okay. It's the same as Blasting Wand. It just doesn't build to anything useful, right? Blasting Wand builds into good items, while this builds into nothing. This is not an AP item. I'm not sure why Stinger is here. I think it's because it used to build into Nashor's Tooth, even though it doesn't anymore. So that's why they have it here. I think it shouldn't even be here. And of course, Killing Jump, we already talked about, it's trash. So, Phoenix Codex is good. Prophet's Pendant, really good. This is okay. This is okay. Everything else is pretty much bad. The basic items, this builds into tier. I think it's pretty bad. I usually either get the full tier or I don't get it whatsoever. I usually skip the Sapphire Crystal. It does help you stack a little faster. Ruby Crystal is actually pretty good. 150 health for 500 gold is good. Amplifying Tome is unbelievably strong. 25 AP for 500 gold is insane. You can stack 5 Amplifying Tomes, and for 2,500 gold, you have 125 AP, which is absolutely insane. So Amplifying Tome is really good. A lot of the times on stream, you'll see me just stack Amplifying Tomes if I can't afford an item, and then eventually my next base, they're gonna build into something, right? Amplifying Tomes build into every single mid-tier component and final thing in the game. So a lot of times I'll just stack some Amplifying Tomes. And Ring of Revelation sucks. 25 AP is way better than 10 ability haste, and it's only 100 gold difference. And that is it for the AP items, and then I'm gonna take a little break first, and then we'll jump into the defense items. Okay, so I've taken my break, I've gotten my haircut, and I'm ready to talk about defense items. First up, Redemption. Redemption is more of a support item, to be honest. You wouldn't really build it on any tank that's not a support, because you want to be around your team to apply it, so it's not going to be as useful in the jungle or Baron lane positions. It's mostly going to be useful on supports. So Redemption gives you this permanent heal when you're around teammates, and it's actually really good sustain. This is a perfect item for champions that don't really care about items, if that makes sense. If they don't really care about items and they would rather just get the tons of ability haste that Redemption gives, the mana that Redemption gives, and the passive of healing your entire team over and over again. It scales off bonus HP, so the more HP you have, the better it's gonna be on you. So this is a great item on champions like Blitzcrank, for example, right? Blitzcrank is all about his grab, right? No matter what items you get on him, he's still gonna do the same thing. No one's gonna be focusing him anyway because he's useless. It's all about his grab. So Redemption gives him some extra utility. Another champion that Redemption works great with is Braum. Obviously, he has the whole gimmick of defending your team, right? And Redemption actually works really well with that. Because no matter what item you get on Braum, no one's gonna be focusing Braum, right? He's also gonna be getting ignored. So you don't really care about other items, other tank items. You can just go Redemption and heal and support your team. And I'll talk about it later, but Protector's Vow is a very similar item to Redemption in that sense. But obviously that's a different use case. Redemption is better for sustain, while Protector's Vow is better at defending engages and burst combos, right? Next up is Guardian Angel, which I think I've talked extensively about Guardian Angel, Sterak's, and Death's Den, so I'm gonna be skipping them. If you're just watching the tank session, I talk about these items in the physical section, so please go back and look for that. Next up, we have Sunfire Aegis. This item has such a strong passive that does so much damage when you're playing tanks, but the stats it gives are just so weak. Just compare Sunfire Aegis to Renwin's Omen stat-wise, right? 100 more HP, and Renwin's gets 75 more armor, right? And Renwin's has a really good passive as well. So when you like compare it next to like other tank items, the stats that it gives are just so mediocre. Even a Warmog gives 200 more HP, Heart Shield gives 200 more HP, and more ability haste, and the health regen, and the passive is arguably better too. So while Sunfire does do a lot of damage, it's such a niche item because of the stats. The stats it gives are mediocre, right? So you really only build this on a few champions that stack Heartsteel, have a ton of HP, and won't wave clear, but don't want to build Titanic Hydra. So I guess that champion would be maybe Sion, maybe Shen, but even those champions usually would prefer Titanic Hydra. You can take it on some aggressive supports like Leona, but it's mostly going to be getting outshined by Zeke's Convergence. So Sunfire is in this weird spot where its passive is really strong and the damage is really good if you can stick to your opponent. However, the stats it gives are pretty weak. The one niche this item does have is tank junglers, because Sunfire helps them clear the jungle. So champions like a Mumu do prefer the Shearing Crown, which is again a competing item to Sunfire Aegis. However, a champion like Nunu actually prefers Sunfire Aegis. So champions that stick on you and auto-attack a bunch, Sunfire Aegis can be really good at. However, its stats are awful. It has competing items like Shearing Crown that are just better. So it's in this weird state of no champion really wants to build it. The biggest example I can think of is Nunu, and sometimes a Mumu if you want to go for both burn items, but even then it's not great. Again, you can build it with Heartsteel to just stack on HP stackers, like the Sion, like the Shen, but a lot of those HP stackers usually prefer Titanic anyway. Moving on, Spirit Visage, one of the most underrated and broken items. Its passive increases all healing and shielding effects on you by 30%, so that's heals and shields that you give to yourself, but also heals and shields that your team gives you. So if you have a support like Soraka, Sona, Janna, Seraphine, this item is gonna increase all their healing and shielding towards you by a ton. The stats it gives are also really good. The build path is really good. Spectre's Cowl is actually an incredible item when you're playing against champions that can poke you down. So let's say that you're playing against Teemo, for example. This item, just getting this item, not even finishing the Spirit Visage, is really good. Teemo mains are gonna hate me when I say this, but and I'll talk more about it when we go to the mid-tier items. But Spectre's Cowl is just an insane counter to champions like Teemo. It's pretty much like a second wind. But Spirit Visage overall is a great item. It's pretty obvious when you should be building it, when your champion, your team in general have a lot of healing and shielding. So similar to when you'd want to build items like Ocean's Trident and Morellonomicon, right? If you think that it's a good game for your opponents to get Morellonomicon or Ocean's Trident, it's probably a good game for you to get Spirit Visage if you're playing a tanky champion, right? Getting all that healing, getting all that shielding increased by 30% can really make a difference, and the stats are really good. Random Omen, this might be the best armor item in the game. If the enemy team has two or more crit champions, you must build Random Omen. So if they have like a Yasuo mid that's gonna build crit, if they have a Yone mid that's gonna build crit, if they have a Graves jungle, Nyla jungle, right? There's a lot of champions outside of ADCs that build crit, like Tryndamere, that's another one, Master Yi sometimes. So if those champs are building crit and the enemy team has an ADC, especially a crit-based ADC, I mean, most ADCs will build some kind of crit, but crit-based ADCs will get 100% crit. Randuin's is a must take. It decreases crit damage and it gives you up to 20% bonus movement speed, which is insane. It's, you know how Force of Nature gives 10% movement speed at max stacks? Randuin's reaches up to 20% movement speed and gives you slow resist on top of that. This item just completely counters crit champions. It's one of the reasons why I have Yone so low on my tier list nowadays. Yasuo does have his tanky build, so he can kind of combat Randuin's, but Yone just gets completely destroyed by this item. So if you have if the enemy team has multiple crit champions, even when I'm playing a carry, I will very often build Random Omen. That's how strong I believe this item is against crit champions. But again, it's very situational. If the enemy team doesn't have crit, there's better armor items you can get. Thornmail, this is pretty much the anti-heal item of tanks. However, it's more than just that. Its passive deals an insane amount of damage when used on the right champions. So a lot of champions get a lot of bonus armor, like Malphite and Rammus as the two most notable examples. And being able to deal 6% of your bonus armor to enemies is insane, especially when you get Amaranth's Twin Guard as an item, which we'll talk about later. It also scales off bonus HP. So again, HP stackers that go Heartsteel benefit by Thornmail quite a bit. Champions like Sion, again, Sett, Shan, all those champions benefit quite heavily by Thornmail. So when you are playing those HP and armor stacker full tank champions, Thornmail is a great item to build. Not just because of the grievous wounds, but the damage is actually pretty insane. Stat wise, the HP is not great, you only get 200, but 75 armor is pretty decent. If you compare it with Random Omen, it's the same thing with just 200 less HP, but you do save 100 gold. So overall, it's not a terrible deal if the enemies have a lot of healing, or if you're playing one of those champions that just stack HP, stack armor. Thornmail is great. I've seen a lot of people build Thornmail on more carry-oriented champions, where if you don't have a lot of HP and a lot of armor, it's usually not going to be worth it. You're probably going to be better off building the Moral Reminder or Morel or Nomcon, depending on what champion you're playing. Moral Reminder is usually going to be the better choice. So I don't really recommend building Thornmail on carry champions most of the time. Next up, Warmog's Armor. This is one of the worst items in the game. In competition for the worst item. It's competing with Collector and a couple more items I will talk about later. Its passive is non-existent. While in 6 seconds you can already recall in Wild Rift. You can recall in 5 seconds and get all your HP back and then just go back in the map. Like being out of combat or not taking damage for 6 seconds, it's too long of a wait, and the heal you restore is kind of slow. 4.5 maximum health per second is kind of slow. You'd need 20 seconds plus to get to full HP. So it's just a terrible passive. And the stats it gives are pretty mediocre compared to Heartsteel, right? It literally has worse stats than Heartsteel. You gain 50% health regen and lose 10 ability haste, and Heartsteel has a 10 million times better passive. So Warmog is pretty much, in my opinion, like the worst item in the game. You might as well just build Heartsteel if you're ever considering Warmogs. I do expect it to eventually get buffed, but as it stands, worst item in the game. Next up we have Deadman's Blade, which I think is a very underutilized item. So Deadman's Blade gives you 250 HP and 50 armor, which are okay stats for an item that's this cheap. But obviously the stats are kind of underwhelming compared to other items, but that's because its passive is so strong. Its passive allows you, it's pretty much the Youmuu's of tanks, right? I think this is very underutilized on roaming supports. Champions like Nautilus, champions like Leona, champions like Thresh, champions like Blitzcrank could really benefit from Deadman's Blade. It's actually a very niche item that I sometimes use on Veigar, believe it or not, just for the movements, because you get 45 movement speed that doesn't leave you until you auto attack, and you just don't auto attack with Veigar in the super late game and you run around being super speedy. Anyway, I'm kind of drifting off here talking about Veigar, but for these roaming supports, Diamond's Plate can be a good choice. However, in terms of just raw stats, it's not really the best item. It's more about the utility you get from the movement speed and how you use that utility. Moving on to Iceborne Gauntlet, and this is the tank version of Trinity Force, Divine Sunder, and Lich Bane. It's again a spell plate item, which they do not stack. And this kills off bonus armor. So again, this can be really good on those armor stacking champions, most notably Malphite, right? The biggest issue with Iceborne Gauntlet is that it competes with Divine Sunder, and all of these bruiser champions want to go Divine Sunder, right? And these pure tanks rarely benefit from the Spellblade passive, even though Iceborne Gauntlet actually gives really good stats. So Iceborne Gauntlet has kind of been relegated to this item that Ezreal buys, Malphite buys, and no one really makes use for, because let's say I'm playing a full tank like Sion, right? Why would I go Iceborne Gauntlet when I can go Randuin's, Thornmail? And it's the same for champions like Ornn. They prefer other items over Iceborne Gauntlet, because most tank champions don't really make use of the Spellblade. Again, notable exceptions are Malphite, which pretty much always builds this item, because anything that scales of armor, Malphite is going to heavily benefit from. So just in a weird spot for a tank item, most champions don't benefit from Spellblade. Protector's Vow, very similar again to the Redemption item. You want to build it on tankier protective supports that just don't benefit from other items. The stats it gives are actually quite good. 400 max health, 40 armor, 10 ability haste. The shield and heal strength isn't that useful on most of the champions you're going to build it on. This is an item that most likely you're getting on Braum, maybe Blitzcrank, can sometimes get on Thrash, right? Those types of champions. They're tanky supports, but they're not diving in, right? And it's the same thing for Redemption. Tank supports that are not diving in. A lot of the time, you can also see champions like Jaina or Seraphine build the Redemption the Protector's Vow, because of course they benefit from the healing and shielding strength. And on top of that, depending on what the enemy team has, Protector's Vow can be super useful on those squishier supports. The shield won't be as great because obviously your max health won't be as high. But imagine you're playing Lulu versus Rengar, right? You know Rengar's gonna jump on you or your ADC. Protector's Vow, having that extra shield can be useful, especially if the enemy team is not building anti-shield. Moving on to Winter's Approach, and this is a very interesting item. It's a tier item, similar to Manamune and Archangels. However, this item is tank-based, right? It grants bonus health equals to your mana. The main issue with this item, similar to other tier items, is that most champions, especially tank champions, don't really run out of mana, right? The few champions that do run out of mana, like Maokai, maybe, you would usually just go worst case scenario mana flow band. The stats it gives are just underwhelming, especially compared to the other tier items. It has found its niches here and there are champions that utilize it very well, especially champions that can consistently proc its passive. I would like to see small buffs to this item, especially considering that no champion has mana problems, right? So even though the stats look nice in theory, you're only really getting 350 HP and 15 ability haste, and you usually want to get it as a first item, and it just makes you so weak in the early game. And tanks are already weak in the early game, so they don't want to be even weaker and just fall super far behind. They're usually better off getting Heartsteel, which will give them more HP in the long run than Winter's Approach. So even as a stacking item, it falls short of Heartsteel, right? So there's just no real reason to get it. I have seen a few niche builds that do get it, especially the champions that can constantly apply the passive, which you apply by slowing enemies or CCing enemies in general. The Fimble Winter passive, and gives you a decent shield. I remember back in the day, Cassian actually used to run this item just to get the constant shield on his third ability and make him tankier instead of the Archangel's item. But overall, it just falls in this weird category of the stats are not good enough while it completely destroys your early game, so most champions stay away from it. Next up is Frozen Heart, which I think is another underrated item. The main issue with Frozen Heart is that it doesn't give HP, making it a terrible choice in the first few items and can only really be purchased as a third, fourth, or fifth item, since you need to get some HP to go along with your armor most of the time. Because if you only have armor and then, like, let's say you go hard steel and frozen heart, you're not gonna have any magic resist and you're gonna get burned down by any magic damage dealing champions in the enemy team. Frozen heart also competes against Thornmail and Randuin's that are usually better choices, right? But it is a good counter to attack speed based champions. Champions that really like attack speed, Frozen Heart is the main way to counter them. Another issue that Frozen Heart has is lethal tempo. Because lethal tempo exists and it's so easy to get a lot of attack speed, even like slowing the attack speed of champions by 36% is kind of useless if you're just letting them auto attack you for free. Like, Frozen Heart was supposed to be this item that's like, okay, if you guys ignore me and you don't focus me, I'm gonna reduce all your attack speed. But most lethal tempo users, which is when you want to get Frozen Heart, get such an overwhelming amount of attack speed that Frozen Heart just doesn't really end up doing its job properly. But again, it's a great item on champions that the enemy team wants to ignore. So let's say you're playing Maokai, right? You don't do a lot of damage, you're just tanky and sticky. It's ideal for the enemy team to ignore you. Let's say you're playing a Mumu, right? Again, you're just, after you do your initial engage, there's no reason for the enemy team to focus you, right? Same thing with Blitzcrank. After Blitzcrank grabs, there's no reason to ever focus Blitzcrank. So if you're playing those champions and the enemy team has attack speed stacking champions, Frozen Heart can be a good choice, especially if you want the following stats. And that's because if they do ignore you, which a lot of the time they do end up doing, the attack speed reduction does play a big role in the fight, even though you can't really see it. The passive effect of it throughout the fight will definitely reduce a lot of damage that the enemy team is dealing. Again, you want to get against attack speed stackers on champions that the enemy team wants to mostly ignore. Next up, Force of Nature, and this is probably the most underrated item in the game. It's, in my opinion, probably the strongest tank item in the game. It's just unbelievably strong, and I'll explain why. So other than stats being incredible, right, for 2,750 gold, you get pretty much similar stats to Spirit Visage, except the health regen, except the ability haste. I'm comparing it to other magic resist items, right? If you compare it to, I don't even know how to pronounce, like Kenikuruken. Anyway, if you compare it to this item, you lose 20 magic resist, so it's in theory slightly less efficient than those items. But its stats are still really good for the cost, and especially considering how strong its passive is. First of all, you just get a flat 5% movement speed, which is always nice for most champions. But taking ability damage from enemy champions, so any ability damage, right, even if it's physical, grants 1 stack of Steadfast. And you only need 4 stacks, so 4 abilities need to hit you, which is very easy for a tank, right? You're tanking a lot of abilities. And at max stacks, you get 10% movement speed, and get ready for this, reduce all incoming magic damage by 25%. 1/4 of all magic damage done to you, wiped. So, you know how everybody says boots are OP, right? Tank boots, for example? 7 to 12% magic damage reduction on Mercury Treads, right? 25%. And what's OP about magic damage reduction is that it doesn't function like magic resist, right? Every magic damage item has a 7% magic penetration, 7% magic penetration. That doesn't get applied to magic damage reduction. So even if the enemies have 35% magic penetration, that does not get applied to magic damage reduction. Magic damage, like physical damage reduction, magic damage reduction, which is what the boots do, is such an unbelievably OP stat. And having 25% of it on Force of Nature is insane. This is one of the most underrated items in the game. If the enemy team has more than 2 magic damage dealers, if they have like 3, 4, or even 5, I always go Force of Nature. I think this item is just unbelievably broken. I'm just in disbelief that people even compare it with items like Rookern, which is nowhere near as good. Obviously, when you compare it to Spirit Visage, I can see use cases where Spirit Visages can be better, depending on the champion and the team comp, because of the shielding and healing factor. However, for 90% of cases, this is going to be the best magic resist item when you're playing a tank. And I will often build it on a lot of bruisers as well if the enemies have multiple magic damage threats. One thing I do want to mention is that it doesn't stack additively with boots. It stacks multiplicative. I'm pretty sure I mispronounced that. But the whole point is, if you have 12% of mercury treads and 25% of force of nature, that's not gonna add up to 37%. The 25% will get applied first, or the 12%, I'm not sure. And then from the remaining 75%, let's say that force of nature gets applied first, so you reduce 25% of the damage, there's 75% that goes through. From that, the 12% will be taken out. So effectively, instead of 37%, as you would think it would do, it's going to do closer to like 32, 33%. So both of them together don't work great. If you are going to get force of nature, most of the time I recommend not going for mercury treads and going for plated steel caps. Amumu is a champion that has physical damage reduction, his third ability, and that's why you never build plated steel caps on Amumu. Most of the time you're going to go mercury treads, so you can maximize your damage reduction from the magic and the physical side. Moving on to the next item, we have Dawn Shroud. Dawn Shroud is... It used to be good during previous updates, but the problem with Dawn Shroud is that the damage is very lacking. Especially when you compare it to Zeke's Convergence, right? This item is supposed to be on engagers like the Leona, like the Nautilus, that want to go in, deal some extra damage with their combos. The stats it gives look pretty good, especially for the cost, right? You get both armor and magic resist, but the problem is you just can't compete with Zeke's. Zeke's does 480 to 900 damage on your engage, right? And he has an AoE slow. Dawn Shroud does 80 plus 5% bonus damage when you stun. Let's say you proc this 4 times during a fight, right? Which you won't, by the way, but let's say you proc it 4 times during a fight. That's gonna do like, at best 500 damage, which is nowhere near as much as Zeke's is gonna do. So the main problem with Dawn Shroud is that it just gets outshined by Zeke's by a lot. But even then, let's say that Zeke's didn't exist, it still would be kind of a niche item because of its lackluster damage compared to what other items can offer you. Usually when you play champions like Leona, right? Yes, your burst is good, but your main goal is to do a good engage and provide the utility needed for your team to follow up with damage. It's not your role to do the damage, right? And while it can be kind of useful to do a bit of extra damage, especially in the early game, and this is supposed to be kind of an early game item, again, in those situations right now, Zeke's just completely outshines it. So there's never really a reason to build it. It's just that it doesn't provide utility. It just provides a bit of damage. And when you're playing engaged supports, which this item is meant for, right? You're never building this in the Baron lane. There's way better items that do similar things like Heartsteel. But if you're playing support and you want to deal the extra damage when you're engaged, doesn't make sense. Go Zeke's, provides both damage and utility with a 25% slow. So this item just doesn't fit anywhere, right? No champion wants to build this item right now. So it's kind of trash, is my point. Amaranth's Twin Guard. This is probably the best stat item in the game. I would say the best tank item in the game if it wasn't for Force of Nature. Amaranth's Twin Guard gives just an insane amount of stats. You get 60 armor and 60 magic to begin with. But after being 5 seconds in battle, which is actually quite a bit, by the way, people underestimate how long 5 seconds is. But it's quite easy to kind of proc through poke, right? You get poked before the fight starts, or you do some poke before the fight starts, so you've already gotten a few seconds in. But after you stack the 5 seconds, you gain 20% size, 20% tenacity, and you increase your armor and magic resistance by 30%. And this isn't your bonus armor and magic resistance, this is your base armor. So every champion has around, every melee champion at level 15 has around 100 base armor. So this item will give you 30 armor and around 15 magic resistance. Let's say that 50 magic resist. The average is not that high, it's like 40. So let's say that, let's say you get 30 armor, 10 magic resistance just from your base stats. Now add the 60 armor and 90 magic resist. The base stat, let's say you just get Amaranth's Twin Guard, no other tank item, you will get close to, just from this item, 100 armor and 50 magic resist just from this item when it's fully stacked up. plus the 20% tenacity. Now, if you are building tank, right, because a lot of carries you see build Amarant's Twin Guard later in the game. But let's say you are building tank, right, and you're playing a champion like Malphite or Rammus, they already get like 300 armor, right? This item will just give them up to like 500 armor, which is absolutely insane. So this is like the Rabadon's death cap of tank champions. Once you already have a few tank items, Amarant's Twin Guard is a third, fourth, or fifth item. It's just so insanely powerful, and I consider them must build on pretty much every tank. And it can be built on carries, especially on carry champions that build a bit of magic resistant armor to complement the 30% increase. So let's say Kaisa that goes plate steel caps, and a lot of the time goes for wits ends as well. You get that magic resist, you get the armor, you get that extra HP as well, which the more armor and magic resist you have, the more effective your HP will be, right? Because it's harder for the enemies to take your HP. And then you build the Twin Guard as a fourth item, as often Kaisa players do, and you're just insanely tanky while still dealing insane damage, right? The amount of tankiness this one item gives you is crazy. Moving on to Mantle of the 12th Hour, which is very similar to Twin Guard, in the sense that they both give quite good magic resist and base armor. This gives 40 armor and 40 magic resist and 200 health. So stat-wise, it's actually better than Twin Guard, just base, right? It's 200 gold cheaper, it gives better stats, I think, with the 200 health. But also has a very unique passive, which is similar to like Sterex. It's a lifeline passive, right? And it's insanely good on HP stackers, right? Because it heals you for 45% of your bonus health. So a champion like Set or a champion like Sion that has gotten a lot of HP through Heartsteel, Mantle of the 12th Hour pretty much gives you a second life, right? Let's just think about how insane this is. Let's say that you are playing Sion in the late game, and you have gotten 1,000 Heartsteel stacks, 1,000 extra health from your passive. You have 7,000 HP, right? 5,000 of that is bonus HP. So this item, when you fall under 35%, is gonna heal you for 2,300 HP. That's an insane heal. You just received a 2,300 HP heal, right? Pair that up with Spirit Visage and just heal back your full HP. It's a great item in theory, but the problem is that there's just better tank items out there, right? Twin Guard is just a better tank item. Force of Nature, better tank item. Randuin's better tank item. Thornmail, better tank item. So usually tanks can't really find a way to build this item consistently. However, it is quite underrated, and it does have its uses. Another problem is anti-heal, right? Anti-heal completely destroys this item too, because it's not even a shield. Sorry, see if it's a shield. It's a heal. So it kind of gets completely countered by anti-heal as well. So while I do like it and I do think it's a strong item, it falls short of other options and it gets countered too easily by anti-heal. So most of the time, you don't want to be building this item. I don't think there's any... The best champions to build on are these huge HP stackers like Sion, like Sad, like Shen. But most of the time, Twin Guard will just be better for fighting. Searing Crown is next, which competes again with Sunfire Aegis. However, Searing Crown is just better because it gives you way better stats for cheaper gold. 300 armor, 300 HP, 50 armor compared to 500 HP, 15 ability haste. The passive also is more effective at dealing damage quickly, right? Sunfire Aegis relies on long fights where you can stack it, while Searing Crown does its damage immediately and it's based off the enemy's HP. So it's always going to be consistently doing damage. So most tank junglers would prefer Searing Crown, especially those that have AoE abilities like a Mumu. A champion I didn't mention on Sunfire, Maokai actually likes Sunfire, Maokai jungle. Maokai Baron lane as well, right, because he doesn't go Titanic. He prefers Sunfire, so that's another niche case. But Searing Crown is just better in those cases. Again, I'm mostly thinking about a Mumu, but there aren't that many tank junglers, right? Because these two items are made for jungling. So you can kind of decide between, when you're playing Nunu, Maokai, or Mumu, you can choose between Searing Crown and Sunfire Aegis. Shingon has better stats, but again, its main issue is that it has very limited users, right? Not many champions want to build this. You can build this on like a Malphite as well, especially when you poke with your first ability, having it deal extra damage. But overall, neither of these items are great. This item has better stats. It's still, I consider it a little better of a tank item. Sunfire Gabe is better for like longer fights. Now let's move on to perhaps the most loved tank item in the game, and that's because of its infinite HP scaling. When you're near an enemy, for 2.5 seconds, a red mark stacks up and appears. If they leave the range, you lose the mark, but if they stay within the range and you auto-attack them, you gain permanent HP and you deal bonus damage. People just love this item because you can stack it infinitely. My verdict is that this item is quite overrated, however it's still very, very strong. When you're playing these HP stackers, like Sion, like Shen, like Set, that you just want to stack a lot of HP with and be an absolute menace. Swain does this too, and Heartsteel is a great choice. However, I see a lot of players build it on champions that should not be building Heartsteel. I see a lot on Garen. I see a lot on these bruiser champions. I even see it on carries sometimes. I even make some fun troll builds where I play champions that shouldn't be played tank, and go Heartsteel, like Yasuo, Akali. Those are fun builds, but in reality, Heartsteel is only really meant for those champions that really want to stack a lot of HP, and it's not as useful as people make it out to be. Even on champions like Ornn, it's most of the time the best item, but not always, right? I just see this as like the default must build, must stack every single game on tanks. And while I do agree that it's really, really strong and the permanent HP, especially in like a ranked games, right? It's so easy to stack it. Even when you play support, right? It's so easy to stack it because players are just so bad and you're able to get so many free stacks that you shouldn't be able to get in reality if the enemies were competent. So for most players in most elos, Heartsteel is just good, right? Because you're able to get so many stacks. The game usually doesn't end quick. There's so much fighting that goes on, right? When I play in Legendary Queue in like the high-elo games versus good opponents, you see like 20 kills per game max, right? But in lower elos, you get 20 kills before the laning phase even ends, right? There's so much more fighting that happens all the time. So many more opportunities to stack Heartsteel. So if you're playing in lower elos especially, Heartsteel is going to seem even better than it actually is. So a lot of players will build on support. Even though it's a terrible support item, you will see. And when I say low elo, the problem with Wild Rift is that even in Master and Grandmaster, it's like pretty low elo. The quality of the games are pretty low. Like if you compare Heartsteel to in Wild Rift and PC League, completely different, right? No one builds Heartsteel in PC League, like in pro games. I think only Skarner builds it, but in high elo and like in pro games, no one builds Heartsteel. But in Wild Rift, even in Master and Grandmaster, you can pick Jarvan support, Swain support, and just stack Heartsteel to 10,000 health. And you know exactly which support player I'm talking about that encourages Heartsteel in every game. And respect to Broken support, right? Because he makes it work. Because it's a great item when there's perma fighting going on, because you get so much HP. And he kind of, with his playstyle, he perma fights and you're able to stack Heartsteel quickly. So overall, the verdict is that it's a great item, but it relies on the enemy team playing bad, which a lot of the time they do, and you're able to get a lot of free stacks, and you're able to be super tanky in the late game. So when should you build it? On huge HP stackers, and you can build it on supports, even though it will probably make your early game quite a bit worse. Next up, Titanic Hydra. I talked about Titanic Hydra on the physical side, but pretty much, if you didn't watch the physical side, give you a quick rundown. This item has been balanced around Heartsteel, which is really sad. Riot assumes that you're building Heartsteel when you build this item, so the AD you gain and pretty much all of its stats are based on you having a shit ton of HP. So if you're not playing the champion, if you're not building Heartsteel, if you don't have a champion that gets huge amounts of HP like Sion, Titanic Hydra is not good. But if you are playing Heartsteel with champions that love stacking HP and AD, like Set, like Shen, like Sion, like Jarvan support, right? Titanic Hydra can actually be pretty good. Actually, I don't think Jarvan support ever builds this, right? Your support. But those HP stackers that build Heartsteel love building Titanic Hydra because of how well the items synergize. Especially if your champion has AD scalings and wants more AD, like the Scion, like the set. Moving on, Ziggs Convergence. This item has been absolutely OP for a while. It's received a lot of nerfs, so now it's in a slightly better position, but I still think it's quite strong. What champions build this, right? Champions that want to stick on you, but don't have the easiest time doing so. And champions that stick on you already and just take it for the damage, right? I've seen this build on Leona, Nautilus, Mordekaiser, right? Mordekaiser ults you and then he has a blizzard constantly while you're stuck in his ult. Amumu sometimes builds this as well, right? So it's champions that really want to stick to you. I've even seen this item build on Master Yi, right? So people can't escape Master Yi. On Shyvana sometimes, so people can't escape Shyvana. It's champions that get easily kited, that wanna really lock you down, right? That's where you're gonna build Ziggs. And the stats he gives are actually really good for the price. For only 2,700 gold, you get a bunch of armor, bunch of HP, get some mana, which is actually nice for a lot of those champions. They do end up having mana problems because they're usually not getting boots of mana or any other mana items. And the ability haste does help out too for most of those champions. The cooldown is really low, so you're pretty much always gonna have it up when you ulti on most champions. The slow is really good, and the movement speed actually comes in clutch a lot of the time too. When you're playing a champion like Leona, like Nautilus, and you do engage, the 55 movement speed behind you helps your team follow up on those engages. So you should pretty much always be building it on these engage supports, and it can be a good niche situational item for champions that want to stick to their prey, even if they're not supports, like the Amumu, like the Master Yi, like the Shyvana, like the Mordekaiser. But for the most part, this is, another good example is Maokai, right? Especially Maokai support. Most of the time, engage supports want to build this, like Maokai, like Rakan, like Leona, like Nautilus. Moving on to two newer items, and that is Kinnick Rookern and Yordle Trap. Let's talk about the magic resist item first. So the main issue with this item, even though I do like it in theory, it gives really good stats, like really good stats for 2,800 gold. And he has a passive that's actually pretty decent, right? If you're an HP stacker like Scion, right, like Sat, like Shan, if you're an HP stacker, you do like this item in theory, but it's so hard outshined by Force of Nature. The times where this item will be better than Force of Nature are so low. I'm going to say that 99.9% of the time, Force of Nature is just better, right? There's no reason for you to build this on a champion that doesn't stack HP, because the shield is quite low if you don't have HP. So if you have like 5,000 HP, you can get like a 500 magic resist, magic damage shield. But the magic damage that this is going to reduce is going to be way more than 500 throughout the fight, right? So it just gets completely outshined by Force of Nature. And don't forget, Force of Nature also gives 15% movement speed, 5% flat, and 10% when it's stacked. So the main issue with this item is that it's nowhere near as good as Force of Nature, and it kind of fills a similar purpose. You can argue that this is better against poke, but if you're playing a tank, you don't care about poke. That's not a thing you consider. Magic damage poke, you're playing Ornn and you're gonna getting poked down by Ziggs. That's not a real situation in game, right? So this item, while it is good, it needs Force of Nature to just get removed for it to shine, in my opinion. It's always outshined. And I'll talk about Yordle Trap, the newest debate item from Riot Games. I'll be honest, this item is really, really funny. So the stats it gives are horrendous, but it's only 2,500 gold, which actually makes the stats pretty gold efficient, right? Obviously, when you compare it to something like Random Ones, it's not great, but if you compare it to Deadman's Plate, the stats look pretty good, right? But again, we'll already talk about Deadman's Plate not having great stats. But it's insanely cheap, only 2,500 gold. But obviously, people don't get it for the stats, they don't even care how much it costs, they get it for the passive. So, after using abilities to apply crowd control effects that displace the enemy, you gain 30% movement speed for 3 seconds and mark the target, reducing their armor and magic resist by 5 to 12 for 5 seconds. If the target dies while they're marked, their death grants a bonus 200 to 300 gold that will be evenly shared among you and your nearby allies. The bonus gold can only be obtained once every 10 seconds. So this is a very clear pick item when you catch someone out. So who are the best champions for doing that, right? Blitzcrank, Nautilus, Thrash, the Hook champion, Spike. Obviously Pike would never build this because she needs to build lethality. But this is a very clear pick support item. So when you're playing a support, that can easily pick off enemies that your team can focus and you can kill quickly, get some bonus gold for your team. It's a pretty bad item, I'll be honest. The only champions that you can really build this on, obviously I think it's great on Blitzcrank. He's the most easy example, right? Because Blitzcrank doesn't really care about items, like I said, that's why you build Redemption on him. Because my items just don't really matter for Blitzcrank, no one's focusing Blitzcrank, his stats don't matter that much, he's just a grab bot. And this kind of enhances his grab bot by reducing the armor and magic resist from the person that you grab. The gold is kind of like a meme, right? Getting like 20% extra gold. Like when you kill a target with an assist, you get 500 to... You get around 600 gold, right, as a team. Having an extra 200 to 300 just isn't that impactful, because the biggest reason to kill someone in Wild Rift is not just to get the gold for the kill. The XP matters way more, and it's also that they're missing out on resources while you're doing stuff, right? Because they have a death timer, so they're missing out on resources. That's the main benefit of killing someone. You put them behind. It's not necessarily to put you ahead. While obviously a little extra gold helps, it's mostly the experience. So in reality, this Yordle trap enhances every kill you get will be 5 to 10% better off in terms of value in game. So the gold doesn't really matter, right? What really matters is the magic and magic resist and armor reduction, right? Which overall helps your team burst down that target, and the cost of the item you can get with 2,500 gold, which helps a lot of supports early on, because supports get less gold, so items can be expensive. This item is a bit of a bait, but it is really good on Blitzcrank. I think it can be good on Thrash, and again, when you're playing these lower elos and you're able to get 12, 13, 20, even 30 kills sometimes as a support, like 30 assists, right? It can be good. You can snowball the game quickly, right? But it's more of a noob bait trap. Competent opponents are not just going to be dying to you like flies and helping you farm gold. And if you have worse items than them, they're going to be stronger, right? Let's say that you're playing Thrash and you have Yordle trap, right? And the enemy Nautilus or Leona has Zeke's convergence. And you're fighting a 2v2. Who's going to win that 2v2? It's not going to be Thrash with Yordle trap. It's going to be Leona or Nautilus with Zeke's convergence. So that's kind of what you have to think about when you look at items, right? So this is kind of a bait item. Again, it can work on a couple champions in a few situations, especially if you're playing Blitzcrank versus like a ranged champion, where if you grab them, you pretty much always get one shot, right? Then you can take it, but again, very niche. Let's talk about the mid-tier items. Tier that builds into Wondrous Approach. No much more to say, right? Catalyst, I'm just gonna call it bad for tanks. Catalyst, bad for tanks. It only builds into Redemption anyway, and like neither of these items are actually that great. If you look at the Redemption build path, neither of these items are very great, so its build path kind of stinks until you finish it. But yeah, bad. Sheen only builds into Iceborne Gauntlet, bad. Seeker's Armor Guard, I'm not even sure why it's on the tanky items. I guess it does give armor, but you don't even have the complete Crystalline Reflector in the armor items, even though it gives armor and HP. Maybe it should be here, but I don't know why this is here. Bambi Cinder, you're only taking this on tank junglers to farm your jungle faster, right? Which even then, most of the time you're basing a game complete Searing Crown or Sunfire Cape. I guess on your first base, very often you'll go Bambi Cinder. It's okay, right? Spectre's Cow, insanely good item against Poke. It runs counters. It's the best item for countering AP range champions if you're melee, bruiser, or tank, right? I actually even recommend this item if you're gonna play like a mid lane bruiser. A lot of people play like Renekton mid, other melee champions like Riven. Just getting this item completely negates any poke you might face. It just a lot of the time it's already unnecessary, so you're kind of wasting your gold in a sense. But it's actually a really, really great item and does build into all three magic resist items, right? So if you're gonna get a magic resist tank item in the late game, you can actually just build this early on to completely counter magic damage range champions. So Obviously, Teemo is the best, the most obvious one, but sometimes enemies will try and be funny and take other poke champions. This is even good against physical poke, right? It doesn't matter what kind of damage you take, it's gonna build into magic damage items. But even if you're playing against a Vayne top, or if you're playing against a Kalista top, a Varus top, champions that will poke you, like those champions in the solo lane, Spectre's Cowl as a rush item combined with Second Wind is actually really powerful, and I think kind of underrated. Like this actually a great item against Darius, for example, right? Because he hits you one, his bleed lasts forever, and you're getting so much healing constantly. Obviously, you don't have to finish the item against Darius or any physical damage champion. But you could, for example, if you're a Heartsteel stacker, go Heartsteel, build a Spectre's Cowl, and it's going to be probably more efficient than if you were to get, let's say, Warden's Mail in terms of winning lane against these ranged top laners. Kindle Gem, we've already talked about, it's pretty bad stats. Giant Slayer, Giant's Belt, good stats, 1000 gold, 300 HP, good stats. Warden's Mail is actually really good versus attack speed based champion. So if you're against an attack speed based champion, reducing 15% is actually really good for 1050 gold. That's actually really useful when you're playing supports like the Leona or the Nautilus and you want to go into the Random Summon or Blitzcrank, right? Let's say you want to go into the Frozen Heart. Getting this item early on is actually really good. Because, first of all, the stats are decent, 35 armor. Even though this gives 40 armor and it's cheaper, the 15% attack speed reduction is pretty good. You're negating, like, a whole dagger from the enemy, right? Which 15% attack speed. You're negating a dagger when you purchase this item, right? So its actual value is, like, closer to 1,400 gold. So it's actually really good value-wise. Chain Vest, 40 armor, 900 gold. Can't be mad at that, pretty good. Bramble's Vest, really good, being able to get anti-heal for only 1000 gold, and it still does quite a bit of damage, right? 4 damage plus the 6% bonus. Really good item against healing champions, right? If you're against like a Fiora, if you're against like a Jax with I guess Jax doesn't heal that much. He usually does with Grasp and Divine Thunder. But if you're against healing, Bramble is actually really good. We already talked about Jim's Fist, it's an okay item. Winged Moonblade, situationally really good. Usually I don't really like it. Like I'm pretty sure I talked bad about Aether Wisp, but this is actually pretty good, especially for roaming supports. It only builds into these two items, right? But a lot of the time, like I said, I love Force of Nature. So if I'm playing a roaming support, I can go Winged Moonblade early if I'm playing like Thresh, and then eventually I want to build a Deadman's Plate. But Winged Moonblade is pretty good because movement speed on these like roaming supports can be really valuable. Obviously, if you're building Force of Nature and you're playing a tank, most of the time you're going to be building this first, right? But Winged Moonblade is actually decent for those roaming champions. Mega Drone Cloak, 900 magic resist, or 40 magic resist, 900 gold, good item, right? Glacial Stride is actually pretty good. 20 armor, 150 mana, and 10 ability haste. Like if your champion needs the extra mana, obviously it only builds into these items, but if your champion needs the extra mana, and you're going to build into Zeke, so this is actually not that bad. And Surging Scales is actually a really good item because of the slow resist, right? If you're playing against enemies with a lot of slows, and you're going to be building into, most of the time, Amaranth's Twin Guard, right? This is actually a pretty good step to it. It gives 40 armor like Chain Vest, so it's not super efficient. Okay, let's talk about support items. So, for some reason, Morello is considered a support item. I usually would avoid getting this on most supports. Like I said, even with mid laners, Morello is just not that good. It's a lot better if your ADC or physical damage dealers can build Mortal Reminder. However, if you are in a situation where your ADC is playing something like Kai'Sa, that doesn't really build Mortal Reminder, right? In those situations, you can go for Morello Nomicon. Of course, the best users of this in the support role is going to be mage supports, whether it's Brand, Zyra, or Lux. Those champions are going to utilize the stats the best. However, obviously, if you are playing mage supports, usually you're going to be going poke items like Luden's Echo, you're going to be going damage items like Liandry's Torment on Brand and Zyra, Death Cap, Infinity Orb, right? But if you do need to build it, it's best on those mage supports. You don't really want to be building Morello Nomicon on enchanters, right? If you're playing something like Seraphine, Janna. But if you really need to, it is an option. what I would recommend doing is just sitting on Oblivion Orb if you really need to, and then like if you're playing versus Soraka, right, and your ADC can't build Mortal Reminder, then you can go for Oblivion Orb and then start building into your support items or whatever. Next up, it's Ardent Sensor, a really broken item that gives an insane amount of attack speed, extra bonus magic damage on hit to your allies. The stats are wonderful. It gives you HP and ability haste, and gives 10% heal and shield strength, right? Redemption gives 5, Protector's Vow gives 5, so this gives 10%. So this is a must build on pretty much every enchanter when you have an attack speed based ADC. Obviously this is not great when you have like a Jhin or a Corki as your ADC, right? Something that doesn't really auto attack a lot. But for more traditional ADCs like Kai'Sa, Vayne, Caitlyn, Tristana, even Ezreal, all of those ADCs will benefit heavily from Ardent Sensor. The one issue with Ardent Sensor is it doesn't give mana. So when you're playing those enchanters that are pretty mana hungry, right, you need to make sure that you're balancing your mana with your other items. Especially since Ardent Sensor is an item that you usually want to get pretty early on into the game, usually first or second item. So just, watch out for your mana. However, a must build for pretty much every enchanter champion. Harmonic Echo, very similar to Staff Flowing Water and Ardent Sensor, a great enchanter item. The stats it gives are actually pretty good. You get a 10% heal and shield strength. You actually get mana, which is really nice. You get 10 ability haste and 55 AP. But more importantly, you get a similar passive to Luden's Echo, but instead you heal. So this is an incredible passive when you're playing champions that heal and shield a lot, like a Diana, like the Seraphine, even like the Lulu, right? Lulu is less so a typical enchanter, as she doesn't rely on shields and heals. She has just one shield and it's not even very strong. She's more of like a buff champion. But when you are playing those enchanters, Harmonic Echo is going to be another great choice, especially since you can AoE heal. Well, not AoE heal anymore, but you're able to heal your teammates. I do think that Harmonic Echo is a little weaker than Ardent Sensor and Staff of the Flowing Water. However, it's still a good choice. Moving on to Staff of the Flowing Water. This is probably the best enchanter item because it grants both of you 15 ability haste and ability power, and this is stats that you really like. Ardent Sensor used to grant to both of you those stats, but obviously that's not useful on enchanters. It doesn't even do that anymore though, they've changed it. But Staff of the Flowing Water grants healing and shielding to... when you grant healing or shielding, you get the 15 ability haste, which is actually a lot considering that it already gives 20 ability haste. So if you keep proccing Staff of the Flowing Water, you have 35 ability haste, which is a huge number, and you also get mana, which obviously is going to be useful when you're spamming so many abilities. You get some decent AP, and you get some health as well. This is a great item for, again, enchanter champions like the Janna, like the Sona, like the Seraphine, like the Soraka, and so on. If I were to rate these items, I would say this is probably the best one for yourself. Ardent is the best for attack speed hypercarry ADCs, right? If you have a hypercarry ADC, then Ardent is a must. Staff is pretty much a must, I would say, in most enchanters anyway. It just works super nicely with most of these champions because of how much ability haste you can get. Harmonic Echoes, it's okay. The main issue with Harmonic Echoes compared to the other two is that it doesn't give stats, right? It's more of a healing item that's like when you're playing Seraphine, or when you're playing Sona, Seraphine, those types of champions, Soraka, the enemies are already probably buying anti-heal. And it's also competing with Redemption, right? Which gives more HP, same amount of mana, more ability haste. It just doesn't give the AP. But most of these enchanters don't really care about AP that much. They mostly care about the base stats. So it's also competing against Redemption, which is like a tankier version. And it AoE heals the team, while Harmonic Echo now only heals an ally, right? Even though the healing is decent. So this is kind of the explanation of the three enchanter items. Now moving on to more aggressive items like Imperial Mandate. Imperial Mandate is good, but the big problem it has is that the champions that want to build Imperial Mandate usually just build full AP instead, right? Because they have really high AP scalings. However, champions that don't have high AP scaling and still want to do more damage can be good, right? The movement speed that you get on the detonation is actually pretty good. The damage is pretty good, especially if you get it as a first item. So I definitely recommend this item if you want to go more supportive builds, but you still want really some damage early. It can be good on champions like Nami. It can be good on champions like Janna with her first ability. She can proc it pretty easily. So if you do want to be more aggressive, there is some space for Imperial Mandate. However, it's not necessarily a must build since the audience of this item, right, those mage supports usually just go full AP, right? If you're playing Lux, you're not going to be going Imperial Mandate, you're probably going to be going full AP. I think what could potentially help this item is if they gave it the 7% magic penetration that other AP items gets, but as it stands, it just kind of gets overshadowed by full AP builds. However, it definitely has a place if you are planning to go more supportive after you want some initial damage. Next up, Ocean's Trident. If you're playing an AP support champion, the enemy team has lost shielding, this is a great item to build. Again, if you're playing Brand, if you're playing Lux, if you're playing Heimerdinger support, if you're playing any of those like mage supports, Zyra is probably the strongest one right now. Ocean's Trident is actually a great answer to lost shielding, especially because it kind of allows your team to not be forced to build it themselves. Like your ADC isn't, usually no ADC is going to be wanting to build anti-shield. So it just kind of allows your team to skip building anti-shield. So if you can get those main supports, please do. But if you're playing enchanters or engaged supports, obviously you're not going to be going Ocean's Trident. Redemption, I think we've already extensively talked about it. On supports, again, you want to build on champions like Blitzcrank, champions like Braum, that you can just constantly heal your entire team, and you're kind of like a mini Soraka. Same thing with Protector's Vow, you want to build in on those champions that want to avoid getting bursted. It's a great answer to assassins. Frozen Heart is actually decent on support, as we talked about in my defense items, on my defense analysis of Frozen Heart, right, for tanks. Frozen Heart is decent on supports, especially because once you go in, you're usually kind of ignored as a support, right? If you're playing Leona, if you're playing Maokai, it's rare that the enemies focus you because there's just more important priority targets to focus. So if the enemies are probably going to be ignoring you, Frozen Heart is a great choice to provide more utility for your team in those fights and force the enemy team pretty much to fight you if they want their attack speed to start being reduced. We already talked about Dawn Shroud extensively. It's not a great option compared to other items, right? Same thing with Zeke's, we talked very extensively. Not a great Zeke's actually a great option, which is why Dawn Shroud is not that good. You would rather just go Zeke's. Earl Trap, we talked about quite extensively as well. When it comes to these items, the only one that's new is the Forbidden Idol, which is actually decent. It gives some HP, it gives some abilities, and gives some shield and heal strength. It can be decent in the early game for champions like Soraka, Sona, champions that heal and shield a lot early on. And of course, it builds into all your favorite enchantment items. So it's actually not that bad for 900 gold. It's a decent deal. When it comes to the support items, as it stands right now, the best one is Ancient Coin because it gives you ability, haste, and health, which are the more useful stats, and then gives you up to 40 AP. Talisman, or it's called Relic Shield, and upgrades to Bulwark of the Mountain. This is also really good because you're able to also stack it. Coin, you just stack the easiest, right? The easiest to stack, and it gives you 15 ability haste. It gives kind of similar stats to this. It's slightly different. You get a little more HP, a little less abilities, but it's a little harder to stack than Coin. However, you do have the option to kind of manage the wave a little better with this. You can fast push a lot faster because you can just kill the siege minions from like full HP almost. So it does give you a little more options as support. However, Ancient Coin is just easier in general to stack. So I recommend sticking with Ancient Coin. Sickle is your other choice. However, this is incredibly hard to stack compared to the other two. Obviously, if you do a good job, you can stack it faster sometimes on the other two. But from my experience, you just stack it too slowly. And it does give more offensive stats, but not that many supports benefit from the offensive stats. Even if you are playing like champions like Pyke that really benefit from offensive stats, usually you're better off with coin. If you're playing even poke, mage supports, usually you're better off with coin. However, if you're confident that you can stack this faster than coin, then by all means, go for it. Now, let's talk about the most important items in the game, in my opinion, and that's boots. You have a lot of different choices, and it's very important to understand what boots do, as they are the most important part of your build. So, boots are pretty much rushed by every single champion in the game. Why? Because boots give you an insane amount of stats for how cheap they are, right? Let's compare Boots of Dynamism to an item like Yomu's Ghostblade, right? Boots of Dynamism give you 30 AD and 10 armor pen for 1,400 gold. Yomu's for 3,000, so more than double, right? More than double the gold, gives you less than double the AD and less than double the armor pen. So when it comes to item efficiency, Boots of Dynamism are going to be more efficient. And of course you get the flat 45 movement speed, while Yomu's, even when it's fully stacked, only gives 40. And does give 15 ability hits, which kind of makes up for it. But boots are pretty much they're stronger than most half the value of a completed item. So if you take a completed item and you cut the value in half that value will always be less than boots usually, right? And that makes boots incredibly powerful. Just look at Berserker Greaves, right? 20 AD, 35 attack speed, and Berserker Greaves are the worst boots, by the way. 20 AD, 35 attack speed. Let's take a look at Blade of the Ruined King. 25 AD, 35% attack speed. Obviously, you don't get the passive, but for less than half the gold, way less than half the gold with Blade of the Ruined King, you get incredible stats. So the only time you won't see a champion rush boots is when they're playing a champion that relies on getting their first item quicker. Usually Kaisa is the most obvious example because you want to get your upgrades on your first ability, which you only do with items, not boots. Another example is if you want to build, let's say, plate steel caps because the enemies have 4 AD, but you're laning against a magic damage dealing champion. Then you probably don't want to rush plate steel caps because they won't be useful in your matchup. So you get your first item and then you get Merc Tread second as you start to kind of leave laning phase. That's the only times where you're not rushing boots, right? Most champions are gonna be rushing boots immediately. So let's talk about them. Glutinous Greaves, 7% Omnivump, 35 attack damage. These are pretty much the item you get when you want to have a bit of sustain and you're an AD champion. The other two AD boots are Boots of Dynamism and Berserker Greaves that are just not as strong. Let's compare first of all, because for ADCs, right, this is the main comparison, Glutinous Greaves versus Berserker Greaves. You get 15 more AD and you lose 35 attack speed. Attack speed is a stat that isn't as important as damage because you can get it with Lethal Tempo, you can get it with Alacrity, you can get it with a lot of different items. AD is just a more important stat overall for most champions. Obviously, if you're playing like Vayne or something, then yeah, attack speed is going to be better. But for most champions, Glutinous Greaves are just better in terms of gold value, and then you get the 7% Omnivamp, which means that you don't need to rush Bloodthirster, right? You can go for the core that we talked about earlier in the video, Storm Razor, Magnetic, or you just have more choices. You're not forced to go into Bloodthirster because obviously you want to have some kind of sustain. So if you get poked down, you can always just heal back up. You don't have to keep basing all the time, right, and wasting your time. And Glutinous Greaves give you that bit of sustain that every AD champion really, really likes. Next up is Berserker Greaves. These are more situational boots, right? You're gonna build them on some ADCs that really like attack speed. I see these a lot on champions like Sivir, right? That don't want to build attack speed. They want to build, where's that item? They want to build Navori Quick Blades, but obviously to stack the Navori Quick Blades and keep getting their second ability, they like going attack speed boots. You can get these attack speed boots on champions like Vayne. Kaisa usually goes tank boots, but they're rare. But if you're playing a champion that really wants attack speed and you don't care that much about the Glutinous Greaves healing, these boots are also fine, especially when you want to go, if you're going to go Bloodthirster first item. If you just want to maximize your consistent DPS, you go Berserker Greaves, but again, they're just not going to be as good as Glutinous Greaves in most situations. Moving on to Mercury Treads. these two boots are just unbelievably OP, by the way. I think I already talked about damage reduction when I talked about Force of Nature. So if you haven't seen that, go back and watch what I said about Force of Nature. But these boots are so insane. So first of all, they give you 150 and 200 HP, which is a lot. They give you 100% health regen, which is going to keep you from getting poked out of lane. You're going to be able to sustain longer. 35 armor, 35 magic resist, which... Again, 35 armor and 35 magic resist is quite a lot for how cheap that item is. The stats that you get for how cheap the boots are absolutely insane. And then you get this amazing passive. Insanely broken passive. 7 to 12% of all magic damage taken is reduced. 70% of all physical damage taken is reduced. These boots are just a must take. Usually you build them first based on your matchup on like more bruiser or tanky champions, right? If you're playing... And a lot of supports take them as well, right? Tanky supports. But if you're playing against a physical damage dealing champion, you buy these boots, it makes your matchup 10% easier pretty much, or 7 to 8% easier in the early game, up to 10% in the late game. It just makes your matchup so much easier. And it's the same with the Mercury Treads, right? You're playing against a Teemo top, boom, reduce his damage by like 9% in the early game. Just like that. So Mercury Treads and Plate Steel Caps are just a must build as the first item if you want to win your lane 1v1, right? If you're playing, like you see this with a lot of champions in the Baron lane, they will immediately go back. They're both going to have plated Steel Caps if it's like two bruisers, like Renekton versus Riven, or Darius versus Riven, or Darius versus Renekton, or Garen, right? They immediately both go plated Steel Caps because it's just such a big advantage in the 1v1. And it's the same thing with Mercury Treads for versus magic damage dealers. Next up, you have Ionian Boots of Lucidity, who are probably the weakest boots, and are pretty much only good on Enchanter supports. There are a few exceptions, but for the most part, these boots are just going to be weaker than everything else, right? Just compare them with Plate Steel Caps, right? They give the same amount of HP, you don't get the health regen, you get 35 armor, while these give you 30 ability haste, right? First of all, they're also 50 gold cheaper. And look at this spell. Reduce summoner spell cooldowns by 15%. So that's not all your spells. This is just your summoner spells like Flash, Ghost, Ignite, Barrier, Heal, Exhaust, whatever. How is that comparable to taking 7 to 10% less physical damage? It's not even comparable, right? The only champions you want to build these boots on are the Enchanter supports that don't care about being tanky and they don't care about dealing damage. They care about providing utility. So if you can have your second ability up more often on Sona and Seraphine and Soraka, these boots are obviously going to be super useful. If you want to have your shield up more often on Lulu, have that utility up more often, then Ionian Boots of Lucidity are going to be a great choice. Because you don't care about damage, you don't care about being tanky, you just care about utility. So on those utility champions, Ionian Boots of Lucidity can be really good. Even though a lot of players build Boots of Mana just to get more mana, right? Because if you have all this ability haste and you're casting a bunch of spells, you're often running out of mana quite quickly. So while they're good in theory, you end up having mana issues all the time. So even with a lot of enchanters, they go Boots of Mana, who are just another incredible pair of boots. Boots of Mana give you 55 AP, 150% mana regeneration. This is absolutely insane. 150 mana regeneration pretty much guarantees you're not running out of mana. Like, the champions that run out of mana after buying Boots of Mana include maybe Orianna, Kassadin, obviously because his ulti costs like 10,000 mana. That might be the end of the list, right? Boots of Mana just give you so much mana. You don't need to worry about mana as a stat anymore once you get these boots. 55 AP is an insane amount for 1,400 gold, right? Let's take a look at any AP item, right? 85, 85, 75, 70, 75, 80. So the average is 3,000 gold for 80 AP. So these boots that cost 1,400 gold, you'd think should have less than 40 AP, but they have 55 AP. And on top of that, you have 8 magic penetration. Just compare them to Infinity Orb, right? You get more than half the magic penetration, more than half the ability power, and they cost half as much. And on top of that, you get the mana regen, so you never run out of mana. So if you think about it from a gold perspective, Boots of Mana are just absolutely insane, right? Another thing I want to point out for champions, for AP champions that don't want mana, right? Like a Kali, like a Vladimir. Even those champions, most of the time will go Boots of Mana just for the 55 AP and the 8+8 magic penetration, flat magic penetration. But those champions can actually build Plate Steel Caps and Mercury Treads. But what you do have to consider is that eventually you're going to get Death Cap on those champions, right? And Death Cap, so you're gonna be missing out on an extra 45% added bonus on the 50 AP on the 55 AP from the boots. So you're really giving up closer to like 80 AP in like later stages of the game if you choose to go Plate Steel Caps or Mercury Treads. However, those champions that don't have mana can go for the more defensive options. Obviously, Boots of Mana are a must-take on every AP Mage, AP Champion, AP Assassin, right? It's pretty much a must-take because of how good it is. But a lot of enchanters will also build them just for the mana part. I'm a big believer on if your champion is super mana hungry, just going Ionian Boots with tier, and you can finish off tier whenever. But what a lot of enchanters do is just get Boots of Mana, right? 1,400 gold, dealt with all our mana issues. Now we can start building our Ardent Censer, our staff, and so on, right? And especially as you get more mana, it makes the mana regen work even better, kind of, because when you take a break from casting spells, you have more of a pool to regenerate. And finally, we have Boots of Dynamism. This is the go-to assassin AD item. Obviously, there's a lot of competition with Glutinous Greaves again, because while you do get 10 armor pen, you lose 5 AD. So in total damage, let's say that 35 AD plus 0 armor pen does 35 damage. 30 AD plus 10 armor pen is gonna do 40 and maybe a little more depending on how much armor the enemies have. Like AD percentage wise, because you're raiding ability. This is kind of a complicated subject if you don't understand the fundamentals of the game very well. But every champion has base damage and ability scaling. So let's say Z first ability, right? It has a base damage of, I don't know, 200 and then a AD ratio of 100. So the more AD you get, the more that ability will do. But the armor pen works on the base damage as well. So if you're playing an AD champion with high base damages, armor pen is going to be more useful than the AD scaling. If you're playing a champion with high AD scalings, the AD is going to be more useful than the base damages. So in conclusion, when should you build Boots of Dynamism and when should you build Glutinous Greaves? Most of the time on AD casters, champions that cast abilities, because they have base damage, high base damages, Boots of Dynamism will do quite a bit more damage, but of course you're giving up the 7% Omnivamp. But on most assassins, Boots of Dynamism usually will be the better choice. Of course, if you want a mixture of sustain and damage, Glutinous Greaves are great, especially on champions like Zed or Talon that don't actually get sustain from anywhere else. I guess you can go Bloodline to kind of mitigate that. Glutinous Greaves can be a great option, champions like Lee Sin, right? So it is up to preference a lot of the time, but Boots of Dynamism will usually do more damage than Glutinous Greaves, but not by much. So a lot of players do choose the 7% Omnivamp instead. And obviously, it depends on the enemy's armor too. So super tanky champions that have like 200 armor, decreasing 10 of that is not going to be as useful as the 7% Omnivamp to stay longer in that fight too. So versus squishy champions, Boots of Dynamism will be more useful. Versus tankier champions, Glutinous Greaves will be more useful because you'll be getting more healing to continue in the sustained fight. I'll talk about the basic boots. These are kind of bad. 400 gold for 25 movement speed is just not very good. Most of the time, because usually, let's say that you base with 500 gold, right? You can choose between 25 movement speed, or you can choose between 25 AP, 150 health, or 12 damage. You're giving up too many stats to go these boots. So a lot of the time, what I do, if I can, let's say that I base with 1,000 I start with an amplifying totem, right? And I base with 1,000 gold, or with 500 gold. A lot of the time I won't even build boots. I'll just build another amp tome. And then when I have my gold for boots, 900 gold, I'll go base and buy them. What you can do all the time is just buy the boot, tank it, tank the bullet, and then get 500 gold quickly and go base, get the Boots of Mana. But these basic boots by themselves are pretty weak, and I avoid getting them by themselves if I can. Now let's talk about enchantments. Oh my god, finally some active abilities. So, some enchantments are really good, some are just bad, and some are just niche. Let's start with Stasis, one of the really good ones. The cooldown is insane, it's a 2-minute cooldown, but the value you get is so insane. So, think about it this way. Zed ults you, right? Or Fizz ults you. You're about to take 1,000 damage. Boom. Blocked. You just blocked 1,000 damage with one ability, right? The value that you can get from Stasis if you use it properly is absolutely criminal. Absolutely criminal how much value Stasis can give you if used properly. Obviously, it's one of the harder enchants to use, but the value you can get from it is absolutely insane. This is a great defensive tool for carry champions, especially against assassins. Imagine you're playing Talon, you jump in, Stasis, and now you're just sitting there as Talon with your combo out, your blade out, and the enemy's just stuck for 2.5 seconds and you can't damage them. And then the team follows up, catches the assassin out, and you're ruined. Another way to play with Stasis is as an assassin, right? Let's say you're playing Diana, you go in, you do your ultimate combo, and now that you've done all this damage, the enemies are ready to focus you. Stasis. Your team follows up, right? The best example of Stasis is Kassadin. You jump in, do your combo with your ulti, Stasis. Your team follows up, or you can just ult out when the Stasis is up. So absolutely insane broken item, but of course it is the most expensive as well. It costs 1,000 gold, so you're giving up 1,000 gold of stats, which in terms of AP, right, if you're buying Stasis to counter an assassin, you're giving up 2 amplifying tomes, you're giving up 50 AP temporarily, right? So the drawback is quite big with 1,000 AP, but with 1,000 gold, but a good time Stasis is just game winning. Glutinous Locket, this is actually pretty good when it comes to enchanter supports, right? First of all, you're benefiting from the shield and heal strength that you're getting from the support items when you use the Locket, so it's a good choice on a lot of the support champions that build the healing and shielding items. The shield itself is actually pretty good, and it's a good counter to a lot of AoE damage. So let's say that Diana is jumping in with her ultimate, being able to block like half her damage with Locket can be super beneficial if you time it well, right? So it's a good counter to AoE, it's a good counter to engage in general. You can build on some tank supports, like Blitzcrank. Obviously, Blitzcrank a lot of the time will go Proto Belt or Ionian Glory, but it can be a good choice on champions like Braum especially, right? I love going Locket on Braum. Obviously, it gets countered by anti-shield, and a lot of champions love building anti-shield nowadays. So it's a decent choice, right, for more supportive champions. You should never really build it to shield yourself. It's more to shield your team. But I think it is pretty underrated, and it does only cost 500 gold. So it's a pretty good item to have for those support champions. Glory is one of the more underrated items in my opinion. The movement speed you get is absolutely insane towards enemy champions, and it has a very low cooldown of 45 seconds. This item is absolutely underrated. I used to run this item a lot on Twisted Fate. I don't really play Twisted Fate after Cleanse was introduced, because Cleanse is just such a big counter. And that makes his playstyle is kind of unfun. But I used to pretty much run Ionian Glory, get my gold card out, sprint to the enemy, and just stun them with my gold card. But this is a very underrated item for a lot of champions that want to go in and get on top of you, like the Darius, like even the Renekton. I saw Renekton. Obviously, Renekton probably benefits with Proto Belt. And this is the main issue with Glory too. A lot of champions that want to run up to you usually just go Proto Belt, right? Let's say you're playing Maokai, and you really want to run on someone, right? Even with Maokai, you're probably going Ionian Stoneplate. But let's say you want to run on someone, Proto Belt, it will get you there faster, right? So a lot of these bruiser champions, Riven, Darius, that want to get on top of you, usually just go Proto Belt, right? So that's the main issue with the Glory, but it's actually pretty good in my opinion. It's kind of underutilized for champions that love movement speed and love closing gaps. So I love these bruiser champions. But even some mages like Twisted Fate and Veigar, I have faith, can use Glory quite well. Moving on to Pro Build, this is a very popular choice because of course it gives you not just mobility, it gives you a dash, which is super powerful and combines so well with a lot of kits. The most obvious one is probably Echo. Third ability, Pro Build to extend the range, or attack with your third ability to blink to the enemy. It's just absolutely brutally insane. You can use it for Diana to close the range, Fizz to close the range. It's just a good item for closing ranges. You can use on Pike, you can use your third ability and Pro Build to get a little further, to get behind them and get the stun off. It's a great outplay tool, right? The damage does kind of suck, it's pretty low. 70 damage is not very high, but it's definitely a good mobility tool if your champion requires a little bit of mobility. I do see this item build a little more often than I should. I sometimes see on ADCs where the dash is just not long enough to really justify building on ADC. You're probably better off with Stasis or Quicksilver, which is our next item. Quicksilver is the second best. I'm not gonna say second best because there's 3 really broken enchants, and that's Stasis, Quicksilver, and Veil. But let's talk about Quicksilver, which is one of the big 3 in my opinion. So, the big thing about Quicksilver isn't just the active part. A lot of people forget how broken the passive part is. So, first of all crowd control effects except knock-up are reduced by 25%, just flat, right? This isn't even just tenacity, just all stuns, all slows, everything reduced by 25%, which is really insane. Really insane, by the way. Just a quarter gone. Like you're playing against Leona, her third ability roots you, her first ability stuns, her ulti stuns, 25% of that time is just gone. You can get out. So, other than that, which is just a passive, after you use the active, you gain 30% tenacity and 30% resist, slow resist for 1.5 seconds. So, for 0.75 seconds plus 1.5 seconds, you're just super resistant to any kind of crowd control. But now let's look at the active. It's pretty much cleanse, right? It's not exactly like cleanse because it doesn't remove knockups or like ignite, but it grants you immunity to crowd control effects for 0.75 seconds. That means that if Malphite is ulting you and you press Quicksilver right before it, you can get out of it, right? So it's just absolutely insane for carry champions, for ADC champions, just any champion that wants to not get crowd controlled, right? If you're playing a tank, you don't care if you get crowd controlled, whatever, you're a tank. But if you don't want to get crowd controlled, Quicksilver is just absolutely bonkers insane. I say this is a must build on most ADCs. A lot of the time now you'll take cleanse, so you can go for stasis. And kind of competes with stasis as a safety tool, right? Stasis is more to avoid damage, while Quicksilver is more to avoid crowd control. But of course you can also build this on a lot of bruiser champions. Riven likes to build this, Lee Sin likes to build this a lot. I've seen Viego build this quite successfully too. So if you are a champion in the fraud line that's probably going to get crowd control a lot, Quicksilver makes a huge difference and super OP. Stoneplate. Stoneplate is pretty simple. It's the tank item. You gain a huge shield that absorbs a big part of your max health. So you want to build health if you're going to build Stoneplate. This is why you build it on tanks. And you gain additional shield if you're nearby enemies, right? So for every enemy nearby, you gain an additional shield by 14%. The one issue with this item is that it reduces your damage dealt by 40% for 4 seconds, which is actually quite bad for most champions. This does not apply to true damage though, right? Keep that in mind. So if you're playing a champion that does a lot of true damage, like Vayne or Camille, Stoneplate can still be pretty good. But yeah, just a shield, right? It's decent. It scales off your max HP, so the tankier you are, the better it's gonna be. So if you're playing any type of tank, this will be your go-to item. You click in team fights and you just last longer. It does get countered pretty heavily by anti-shield, but again, right, it's only 500 gold. It's probably your best option for a tank. Next up, we have the most useless, but in some situations broken item. Pretty much no one takes teleport unless, right, you die and the enemy team is about to do an objective, you buy teleport, you spawn, and you use it immediately, and you have a chance to be in the fight again. So this is an item that you pretty much only get if you're caught out, and then there's a 4v5 fight and you want to join your team immediately, since the enemy is doing like an objective like Baron or Elder. That's pretty much its main use, right? You never just buy this other than to use it immediately once and then pretty much you never use it again, maybe even sell it, right? That's the use of teleport, and that's pretty much it. The map is too small to warrant any other uses, right? Especially with the portals as well, that you can travel across the map. It just doesn't make sense. Repulsor. This item is pretty much useless unless you're playing against specific champions. So if you're playing against Katarina, for example, this is actually a pretty good item because you can cancel her ultimate very, very easily. She jumps on you, you cancel her ultimate. But for the most part, it's not that this item is necessarily bad, it's just completely outshined by other champions. I don't really see any champion that would benefit from Repulsor. You can build in some supports just to peel off your ADC, but you're never going to go Repulsor and not go Veil, right? The spell shield is going to be so much infinitely more useful even against assassins, right? Megatron. Magnetron, actually, excuse me. This is actually a really bad item again. The only champions that really build this item are Thrash and maybe Blitzcrank to kind of surprise enemies by jumping to a minion or an ally and hooking, kind of increasing your range. But if the enemies are aware that you have it, in reality they should not get caught by it. Protobelt has slightly smaller range, but since you can use it without minions or allies, can be more consistent. So there's no real champion that benefits from Megatron. The only champions that you'd get on would be these hook champions, just kind of surprise the enemy, right, and catch them off guard. That's pretty much its only use. Ionian Veil, this again, it's one of the big three, like I mentioned, Quicksilver and Stasis and Veil. This just gives a spell shield, which is on a super low cooldown, so it's the same passive as Crown, obviously without the damage reduction, and the exact same passive as Edge of Night with a slightly longer cooldown, but you can cast it on an ally. So you already remember how highly I praised those spell shields. Being able to use on allies is absolutely insane. Let's say you're playing Lulu, right? You could go lock it in theory. You could go Dreammaker, which I'll talk about in a bit, but Veil is just, it has the potential to block 1,000 damage just like that on a Fizz ult, a Zed ult. Malphite is ulting your ADC, Iron Veil, boom, no Malphite ult, right? The ability to just completely block out an ability is just too valuable, and especially since your ADC doesn't need to waste any gold for that, right? You can just give it to them. So for 500 gold, it's just a must build on pretty much every enchanter support. There's just no reason to go anything else. I will very often build Ionian Veil if I'm not even playing enchanter support. I could be playing Blitzcrank, I could be playing Braum, and very often I will just build Ionian Veil because of how broken it is. Like, a spell shield is game changing, right? I could be playing like Karma, right, an AP champion. I might even get focused. Instead of Ionian Stasis, I might just go Veil. It's just that strong, especially if you have someone that's really fat in your team and you want to protect them at all costs. It's just too useful. Meteor, this is a very niche item that pretty much only Camille builds because it's so easy to dodge and get out of the damage. And even then, the damage is not very high and the cooldown is very long. While 25% might seem like a lot, it doesn't really feel like it, to be honest. Especially because champions have magic resist, right? It's not really that much damage. Even if you have 2,000, let's say that even the enemy has 2,000 HP, right? You meteor them, 25%. Let's say that they have some magic resist, right? A bit of magic resist. You're probably doing like 15 to 20% of their HP. So you're doing what? 300, 400 damage. Let's say you're doing 400 damage on the high end. You can lock it, blocked, just like that. And you have to actually hit it because the skill shot has a 90-second cooldown, while this only has a 60-second cooldown. So this item is just useless. The only champion that actually builds it is Camille, because of course she can trap the enemies in her ultimate, and they're forced to take the meteor damage. It just adds to her burst. Next up is Hydra, another useless item. The main issue with Hydra is that you only usually get one proc of it in fights. It's a 10-second cooldown, It's not great for wave clear either. It does less damage to monsters and minions. It scales with only AD and AP. So there's just no champions that really want to build this. Champions like Riven, Renekton, whatever, usually just want to build Proto Belt or even Quicksilver or even Stasis. There's no reason for them to build Hydra. It does little damage without really a big benefit. Like usually Proto Belt, which only does 70 damage, will do like a comparable damage to Hydra, right? And it will also give you a dash. Obviously the healing is also kind of like, it's not even real. It's like you get like 30 HP back. It's nothing. So the damage is too low, the healing's too low, the cooldown's too high. Like if you want to make this item work, if Riot wants to make this item work, they really need to either lower the cooldown like 3 seconds, so you can spam it every few seconds in a fight, or just massively increase the damage, or the healing or something. But the stats are just not worth it right now. If it gets buffed in the future, I can see a lot of bruisers build it, but for now, it makes no sense. Dreammaker, which is the newer edition. So whenever you heal or shield an ally, you give them these dream bubbles, which empower them, and the next incoming damage, it reduces the incoming damage by 7 to 140, and the purple bubble deals damage on their next hit. This is actually decent. I don't think it's completely awful. It definitely has its place for healing and shielding supports, but the problem is that why would you build this that will reduce 70 to 140? Let's say that you even proc it you get one every 8 seconds. Let's say that even you proc it 3 times in a fight. That's unrealistic, right? 24 seconds. Even 3 times in a fight, you'll block 350, 400 damage. It's not going to be as useful as Veil, right? In terms of blocking. The extra damage that you will deal kinda helps, but again, it's not as useful as Veil on these enchanter supports. Not as useful as even Locket on these enchanter supports. It just doesn't really have a place. If I'm playing enchanter support, I'd rather go Stasis to be safe from the enemy assassins. I'd rather go Locket to stop in strong engages and shield my team, or I'd rather go Veil to actually protect someone with something useful like a spell shield as compared to Dreammaker. And that is it. These are all the items currently in Wild Rift. That is the video. If you stuck and watched the whole thing, I'm sure that your game knowledge has increased by a ton, and you're going to be an absolute build master going on to your future games. You're probably going to be able to craft and theory craft better builds. But most of all, I hope that I made you a slightly better Wild Rift player. Thanks so much for watching. If you want to watch a similar video for runes, please comment down below. If you want to watch a similar video even for a champion class, right? I've thought about doing like a video for every single champion, but I realized that would take like 20 hours. So I think I'm gonna do classes like mages, marksmen, tanks, and so on, and you know, make those videos. It will still be very long, right? Make them more in depth and kind of just really discuss its champion. But if you enjoyed this video and you want something similar for runes, please let me know. Comment down below, drop a thumbs up, send this to your friends that don't know how to build. Thanks so much for watching, and subscribe for more Wild Rift content.